Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify, Good Pods, basically any platform, as well as the Sonic Cinema YouTube channel, where you can get not only everything associated with the podcast, but also quick takes that I do for some movies, usually during film festivals, as well as all of the live streams that I've done over the years over on Twitch, and that's at the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will get early access reviews, and right now the big one is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is over there for Patreon subscribers. You can also get series such as Leaving the Collection and Life Soundtrack, and that is over patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Today's guest is returning to the show for the first time in a couple of years. I had him on a couple of years ago. We kind of went through our interactions with kind of discussion, the type of discussions that Film Twitter has when it comes to films, and the types of discussions as far as discovering films. And he's somebody whom I really have come to appreciate their viewpoints on films, even if I don't always agree with them. And it is, and we've got a fascinating topic. But before we get to that, I want to re-welcome to the podcast Jason from the Binge Movies podcast. Jason, how are you doing today?
You said that very diplomatically. Yeah, I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
Well, seeing as though the last time I was on the microphone with you, you were basically going, I don't know what the hell is going on with this person's taste. I don't know what happened. And the thing is, it's like, so if you haven't heard it, I was on a Patreon subscriber show of Jason's, The Anti-Vault for Binge Movies, and we were talking about Alex Proyas's Knowing. And right off the bat, he's like, I don't know what happened to your taste. Maybe it's the pandemic, but something just snapped. And I'm like, what on earth? And it's funny because we recorded it like in August of last year, but it didn't come out until earlier this year. So I completely forgot that part happened. And I'm trying to think of what exactly was it. Was there an inciting movie take that made you think about that?
You know what? Not so much that I can remember. There probably was, but it was more so the fact that there was a line of movies that I don't want to say that was predictable, but I had a sense of, you learn personalities a little bit when you're too involved on film Twitter, and I was like, okay, well, this person's going to break this way, that person's going to break that way, right, and so forth and so on. And you were kind of more of the even keeled sort of, I don't know, kind of Ebert-ish, where it's just like, well, I see good in this, and it didn't really work for me, but I see what they were going for, and you might like it, and that. And then there was something that I think you really went whole hog for, really loving, and I was like, this is insane. And you were one of the only people. I don't remember what it was. There was like 2 or 3 of those in a row. There's also a couple where you were like, this is no good. This is not a good movie. And I was like, wow. And everybody else was like, it's a pretty good movie. And so you just started to be a little contrarian, I think. Not intentional, but just that's the way it happened. And then I have you back on, and you're telling me that Knowing is an incredible film. And I'm just going, wow. So I think it was a cumulative effect. All that it means is maybe you used to be predictable and now you're not predictable, which is probably better, right?
I feel like the more movies you end up watching, because I'm somebody who I try to watch as much as I can. I mean, whether it's film festivals, whether it's different screeners, I don't necessarily stick to just mainstream stuff. I try to watch stuff from movies that are going on 4,000 theaters to movies that are just straight VOD or that may never get released and they're on their festival run. And I think one of the most important things I feel like film critics, film analysts, people who love films and want to talk about films in whatever medium they want to talk about them, I think we not only benefit ourselves by taking in as much as possible, but also benefit our audience. And 100%. I mean, I think that for me, the more I see, and the more things, some of it is certainly the mood I'm in. I mean, some of it is certainly the mood you're in at time when you watch that movie. And I mean, I think that was last summer, and I mean there are certainly, if I remember correctly, there are certainly some movies that I saw last summer where it's like, man, what is going on here? What? And it's weird because of the fact that I kind of feel there have certainly been ebbs and flows with me in terms of why are certain movies not hitting with me the way that I expected them to. And I think you get to those times where it's like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know, because there are certainly movies that should be up my alley that just fall flat with me completely. Yeah. And I mean, I think we all have those phases. I mean, one of the things I love about Binge Movies, and one of the things that I try to do on the podcast here, is I also try to expand my horizons and try to challenge people to watch stuff that maybe is not as easily accessible, and challenging myself to watch stuff that I've never seen before. And
or that isn't in your wheelhouse necessarily.
Exactly. And that's why, when you had me on for the Don Bluth episode, it's like, how would you feel? You asked me, it's like, how would you feel about watching these? It's like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not somebody who, and one of the things I liked about that is that I'm not somebody who considers myself a hardcore animation lover. Yeah. I certainly respect the art form, but I also don't have the technical knowledge, as much technical knowledge and technical awareness of how the art form has evolved as other people do. And but part of the reasons that I was so interested in talking Bluth with you is because of wanting to expand that knowledge, and because of the fact that just based on the films, at least 4 of the 5 films that we talked about, I knew at least all of those titles, but there were still some that I hadn't seen. And so it's like, okay, this gives me a chance to finally watch those. And then also it gives me a chance to really dive into what was Bluth's voice as a filmmaker. And I really kind of love that about that experience.
Yeah, this is not my show, so I won't go on a rant, but I do have a bit of a soapbox, and you just touched on it. And we're currently experiencing it now, and we have been for a while in the quote unquote discourse. And for most people, like, none of this really matters. Most people who come to a theater to see a movie don't care what people on Twitter say about that movie, or even necessarily Rotten Tomatoes. They're going because they saw 50 million commercials for it, which is why we get 50 million commercials. And they've seen pretty much what the movie's going to be, which is why trailers show everything. And they think they're going to like it. And they're willing to spend the $12 to $15 per person to go see that movie. And that's an increasingly smaller population of people who are willing to do that consistently, because it's more cost prohibitive and there's other avenues to be able to enjoy the entertainment. But speaking to and about film criticism, and we're in a weird period where there used to be sort of film criticism, film analysis, and, for lack of a better term, film fanboyism. And those used to be kind of 3 distinct things.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the internet came around and places like Ain't It Cool News started to happen, fanboyism and film criticism started to merge because suddenly people outside of established media, people outside of newspapers, radio, and television could have a voice because of the internet. And so the C. Robert Cargills and other people I won't mention who have since been exposed, Cargill hasn't, but people on Ain't It Cool News, it started mixing that in. And that also happened around the same time that fanboys started to become filmmakers with like Kevin Smith and people like that. So Tarantino, obviously, so the two most famous. So I guess where I'm going with this is now we're 20 plus years down the road from there, and now there's almost no difference.
Yeah.
Between the video essayist or supposed essayist, the supposed fanboy, the influencer, and the film critic. There's no difference for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who want, in an ever-shrinking economy around this stuff, because if the studio has to give access and money, or if someone, slash film or something like that, their piece of the pie, like film websites where you can freelance, write for them and get money, has shrunk considerably. Because you have an infinite supply of people on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube who will do it for free.
Yeah.
Or who will do it for media passes. Or who will do it if they can get Raycon earbud subscription ads, right? So you don't need these websites to pay freelancers. So people who either aspire to that or used to do that are finding it increasingly difficult to make a living talking and writing about films.
Yeah. And
the films they're increasingly having to write and talk about to get any money whatsoever are movies that they perhaps would be their first choice, which in our present day, it's superhero films. What's interesting though is, and I this is something I bang on Twitter, and I can't quite articulate it in 160 characters or whatever it is now. If you go back and take Roger Ebert again, right? Most famous American film critic of the 20th century, arguably, and you read just a random review of his, say from the 70s, of a well-known movie, he'll have incidental comments in there about, as you would, just sort of the context of the modern time in which he was writing. And very frequently, he will complain about melodramas. He'll complain about, well, this movie's good because it's not just another, or this was a fun time at the films, which is we don't have too much fun time at the film in cinemas anymore because it's all about drunk wives and melodrama and bad melodrama and blah, 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 blah. When we think of the 70s, we're thinking about Scorsese and Cassavetes and all these sort of people. We're not thinking about the Apple Dumpling Gang. We're not thinking about how many different movies came out that were bad melodramas, which was most of them. We're not thinking about how many movies that came out that where it's like, well, Dustin Hoffman is a surly single and he's going to have to adopt these 5 kids. That was a trope that doesn't really exist anymore, right?
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of movies like that where you take a random guy and you put him in a heartwarming family melodrama. That used to be not quite a 4-quadrant, but movies used to be divided by young and old. There weren't 4 quadrants. It was adults and kids. And then they tried these middle movies, and most of them didn't work. And it's like, well, you weren't. Most people haven't sat through all the Dirty Harry sequels. Most people who long for the 70s to go, we need to go back to adult dramas, weren't watching what was actually coming out in the 70s, for instance, which is Smokey and the Bandit.
Yeah.
If you want to go back to the day where there was a million car chase movies, and Smokey and the Bandit is the best one of them. And this is where it ties into this episode. Do you want to go back to the days where adult dramas were Swedish erotica films?
Yeah.
You're not watching. And so what that proves is there's so many people who are talking today who confuse complaining about their wannabe job, because most of them aren't making a living doing this. They have day jobs, myself included, are complaining about and griping about something that makes their job less enjoyable. And they're confusing the public, and they're confusing themselves, first and foremost, with bitching about their job with film criticism, or bitching about their lack of opportunity with film criticism.
Yeah.
if you were a film critic in 1970 something, writing for the local newspaper and making a sustainable living, you'd be bitching about how many drunk wife melodramas you had to sit through.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we have fun in the movie? And you'd be praising Donner Superman and Star Wars because finally fun is back in the cinema. That was the main shebang with those two films.
Yeah.
With Star Wars and Superman is finally imagination has come back to filmmaking because everything we had gotten so bogged down into melodrama and realism. And that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
You're always going to have something to bitch about. And never confuse a film critic bitching about their job with whether or not the movie they're bitching about is actually good.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, and I'll get off my soapbox, is that most of the people who are talking about movies today are not actually watching robustly the decade. They dream of this non-existent utopian period of time when real movies were made. When was that, Brian?
I mean,
when was it? Because most of the movies of the 70s are so garish. Some of them are unwatchable. Was it the revival of British Gothic horror movies, which are basically just American remakes of movies that came out in the 50s? Was it the golden era of Hollywood when most of those movies were remakes of silent films?
Mm-hmm.
Was it silent films when most of those movies were remakes of vaudeville? When was it?
Yeah. No,
Hollywood has always been full of retreads. It's always been full of remakes. And it's always been mostly full of crap because its primary concern is it's a carnival and it's about getting people in the tent. And you know that better than anybody because you work in the tent.
Yeah.
It's about, can we put butts in seats? That's all they care about.
Mm-hmm.
If Westerns do it, you're going to get a million lousy Westerns.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many Westerns, we don't talk about it anymore. We only talk about 10 Westerns that have ever been made. And there were hundreds that were made because most of them are crap. The genre we're going to be talking about today doesn't exist anymore. Does not exist.
No, it really doesn't. And it's fascinating for that reason.
Yeah. But it drew audiences, at least adult audiences. And it was a major, I mean, where we start and where we're going to end up, by the time we get to the 1980s, the sensibilities of the 60s Sexploitation movie, which is our subject matter, has just worked itself into mainstream film.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is that you got a lot of people on Twitter who they're not watching. You're not sitting through all the different Fulci films. You're not sitting through the great foreign cinema of the 1960s or whatever. You're not sitting there watching the terrible Italian horror films. I'm not saying Fulci's terrible, but a lot of it, Fulci is nonsense. A lot of it. You're not watching Fulci's Western movies. Most people don't even know that he worked in Westerns and comedies for like 30 years before he made a horror movie. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You're same thing with like Sergio Leone, all these great Italian directors. Do you know what they did? They jumped from genre to genre, whatever was popular at the time in Italy, which was usually just a ripoff of what was popular elsewhere.
Yeah.
In particular, Hollywood. So they all directed Westerns and cowboy movies, and they all directed whatever they were most famous for. They directed 4 other genres before that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like kind of same thing with John Woo. I just did a John Woo episode. John Woo, before he did his first gun fu movie, or his bloody hero film, that style that he's known for, he's already been working for 25 years.
Yeah.
He'd done mostly comedies. Most people haven't seen any of those movies. So the idea that like, I feel like the level of the idea used to be to be articulate in anything, you had to be, if you want to talk about literature, you had to be well read and you had to read broadly and with depth and across cultures and across years, because you had to understand the broader context of literature, at least Western literature. And it should be the same thing with film.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're average moviegoer, no, not necessarily. But if you're going to be analyzing, critiquing, and recommending film, you should be challenging yourself to watch as deeply and as broadly as you possibly can. And that doesn't just mean watching a bunch of Truffaut. It doesn't mean just watching a bunch of art house movies. It also means watching a bunch of junk, because the B side of the A side of Hollywood tells you a lot more about the A side than the A side does.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just watching the standout films throughout film history, you have a very warped sense of what movies even are.
Yeah.
And that's what I see on film Twitter. That's what I hear on podcasts more than anything, is I think most people talk about movies today don't even really know what movies really are. They don't know what the movie business even is. I know I'm sounding like an old man, but that's just where it is. And I've learned that myself, to your point. It's not, I'm not innately more intelligent than other people. I learned it by doing the practice of the show that I do, where, when the show first started, I would have longed for the days of the 1990s. Let's go back to when movies were movies, right? And anytime anybody says that, they usually mean whatever decade they were 10 years old in.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, let's go back to the 90s. And then I watched every top grossing film of the 1990s over a couple year period, 100 films. And there's a reason. You know how many mediocre courtroom dramas I've sit through? But get a Tom Cruise, although Few Good Men is good, but you get a Harrison Ford, you get a Tom Cruise, you get a handsome leading man, and put him in a military melodrama. You put him in a courtroom drama, and even some of the ones that are hit movies, they're not very good.
Mm-hmm.
We long for the days of the comedies of the 1990s. Have you watched the comedies of the 1990s recently? A lot of them are not funny.
No.
They're not funny anymore.
No. If they were ever funny, if they were ever truly funny to begin with, I mean,
it's a good point. Yeah.
And but no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's funny because of the fact that like I was so exhausted after covering the Atlanta Film Festival, which ended up going about a week longer than normal. But the way to your point, to a certain extent, the way I sort of decompressed from that was it was actually watching a lot of 90s action movies. And I mean, it's not new stuff to me. I've seen all of this stuff before. And the thing that really stands out is that, yeah, you're right. I mean, no, is Cliffhanger a good movie? To a certain extent, not really. Like, after that opening, it's very standard. It's very generic movie, but I still enjoy it. But at the same time, you're not going to get me on Twitter and saying, "Oh, this is a terrific movie." It's not. It never really was.
Or to be like, this is what all movies should be. All movies should be like this. Here's what I have found when looking at the past, and this connects to our subject here today. This all does. I have no emotional attachment to sexploitation films. I just don't. It's not a genre. There are people who are scholars of the genre because it is an important piece of, like feminist theory and all this, ideas of how Hollywood depicts sex, and we'll get into it with some of these movies.
Yeah.
And different ideas that were going on in the culture, or at least in Hollywood during certain periods of American history. Like there's an intellectual way to approach this, I guess is my point. It's not just like sleaze. But it's still not it's a genre I was aware of, but it's not a genre that I have any great nostalgia for. But I think what happens is we give enough time to pass, especially if it's a time period where you're either too young or didn't grow up with it per se. You can kind of look at it, and if you do put those intellectual lenses on, you can kind of look at it for what it is. And you can glean, I think, a lot of understanding about the broader trends of filmmaking, because filmmaking is all about, movie making is all about trends. It's all about eras. It's all about time periods. It's about people who are either in step or out of step with what's going on in that time period. And so it's I can look back at certain 90s action movies, to your point now, and ones that I were like, they were mid, in the 90s, they whatever. You look back at them and you go, the story isn't there. It hasn't improved. Maybe it's worse now that I remember. But you marvel at the filmmaking because you realize, man, they're having to shoot this with enormous cameras, incredible, just the very cumbersome lighting setups on 35 millimeter film. not a lot of budget, not a lot of time. Even in for American action films, they tended to be mid budget films unless huge stars were in.
Yeah.
But you look at the stunt work and you're going, my God, because we don't get stunt work like that anymore. That type of filmmaking, that practical type of filmmaking where people were jumping off of bridges, and they were really blowing up the bridge. They found some town in America that needed their bridge blown up. They're like, hey, we'll do it in this if you let us do it for this movie. Mm-hmm. That's how it used to work, Hey, you want that building to come down? We'll take that building down for you, right? Yeah. The Terminator 2 thing. Well, they're going to demo that building. Well, can we blow it up? Sure. It's like you don't see that anymore. It's all CG. Mm-hmm. And I have a deeper, broader appreciation for movies shot on film than ever before because it's increasingly less standard.
Yeah.
The colors, the tones, some of the lenses that were used in the 80s and 90s. I think some of the work, because he tended to direct and DP or be the cinematographer on his movies. I think some of the work, not the scripts, but some of the visual presentation of some Peter Hyams films, something visually we'll never see again, ever. And I find his movies incredibly visually rich, except for The Relic, because you can't see it. But everything else, it's his 80s or early 90s work. Even a movie like Sudden Death, which is not a good action movie, really. But then you look at it and you go, well, Powers Booth's giving you a hell of a performance. Jean-Claude is doing incredible in-camera stunt work with a wide shot. Mm-hmm. Stunt performers he's working with, like it's a level of fight choreography we don't get anymore, even in our action movies.
Yeah,
it's a level of the depth and the focus of the camera and the texture that you can see every bead of sweat that's coming off of Van Damme's face, and just the shine and the lens flares and everything. And it's not a put on. It's not like an aesthetic choice. It's just what they captured in the lens. I think that's awesome. So, but that movie's not awesome altogether. But story wise, script wise, acting wise, other than Powers Booth, who's just chewing scenery. But so I find a deeper appreciation for what used to be standard, what used to be just middle of the road standard movie making. A movie like Blue Thunder, which I just talked about for the 1980s, which is not a good movie in my opinion. It's like, but boy, when that helicopter appears in the sun and just all of a sudden appears in camera, then that's not a CGI effect. That's just they flew a freaking helicopter through the setting sun at magic hour, and it's just it's a visual trick where like you don't see it, and boom, there it is. Oh my gosh, and they're really flying the last 30 minutes of that movie through downtown LA, having a stunt shootout, but they're really there. It's not composited shots or matte painting. They are in downtown LA flying in between skyscrapers and under bridges and in the LA River.
Yeah.
We don't get that anymore. It doesn't retroactively make those movies better than movies today. It just makes me appreciate certain aspects of those movies that we don't get anymore more. And what's ironic is, to sum this all up, those are things that I used to, and we as audiences used to take for granted.
Yeah.
So in 20 years, we're going to be looking back at a lot of this Marvel stuff and Flash and this recent Indiana Jones. And when all this shit is AI, we're going to go, remember when people used to be in movies? Oh, we need to go back to when people were in movies. And I'm not being funny. That's what's going to happen. Remember when people wrote movies? Oh, wow. I remember when people wrote movies. So whatever you hate today, you're going to be nostalgic for in another 20 years.
Yeah. No, and I mean, and to your point on the AI, I mean, that's a big part of why we're probably head for the most amazing reckoning we've seen in this industry when it comes to the Writers Guild currently on strikes. Screen Actors Guild could very well go on strike if they don't approve their deal. DGA could be going on strike. It could be absolutely a breathtaking time to see what is going to happen in the future of this industry, and it's so much of it is about AI, and so much.
And streaming.
it's gonna be fascinating to see what happens in the aftermath. But yeah, you were talking about like the birth of kind of fan culture, fandom sort of kind of taking over film criticism. It's like, and you brought up Ain't It Cool, which is really kind of ground zero for it anyway. And I mean, it's like I started Sonic Cinema, or I started the process of bringing Sonic Cinema to the more online presence in 2003, so 20 years ago. And it's funny because of the fact that at the time, if you had asked me like what type of movie site I would have liked to have been, it would have been Ain't It Cool News.
Yeah.
And it's like,
that would have been anybody. That would have been anybody. Yeah.
And I can't tell you how grateful I am that ended up not being the direction I ended up going.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see if you look at some of the early reviews in 2003, 2004 that got published, it's like you could see that like that was kind of where my sensibilities was heading. And some of the things as far as like fan commentaries and stuff like that that are still available on the website was heading, but really wasn't until I started to really embrace filmmakers sending me their stuff to watch. And some of the really, really low budget film festival only stuff. That's when so much of my sensibilities, so much of my ideas of what Sonic Cinema could be changed. And I am so grateful.
Is that your way of saying you became less of an asshole?
That process still took a little bit of time, but that process did still take a little bit of time. But
that was the thing, though, right? That was the thing, to be a film critic at that time, or like in that style of Ain't It Cool News, which became the predominant style, right?
Yeah,
it was who could kind of shape their writing in the most sharp-tongued way possible.
Yeah. And now I mean people go viral because of like quippy little one sentence things they post on Letterboxd. I mean that it's all the same thing. And it's like you look at so many of the YouTubers, and there's some fantastic YouTubers. I love there's some great YouTubers. There are some great live streamers, but the live stream, it's all one of the things that it's all about the hot take. And that's one of the things that
bingo.
And it's all about the hot take. It's all about having the sharpest take on movie. And it's like, no, that's not what I want. It's like, that's not what I want to do. I want to just talk about film.
Well, you want to know the dirty little secret, and everybody knows this, but the dirty little secret that nobody wants to say out loud is most of these people who complain again about superhero movies, they don't actually have to cover them. Because they don't have a deadline from an editor that's like, Olsen, we're sending you out to go watch the latest Flash film. Yeah. Make sure you get your review back in. It's got to be deadline for publishing is da, 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 da. Like, it doesn't exist anymore. You're doing it because those are the movies that are most likely to get the clicks and the views and the downloads on your podcast. Yeah. So what you could do is if you are so bothered by it, you could just selectively choose to cover those movies you long for, those adult dramas, because by the way, they're still being made. Yeah. And there are more movies being produced today than ever before. Mm-hmm. You just have to work a little harder to get to them. Yeah. Instead of going to the press screening for The Flash, so you can be the first person out the gate with that hot take, crapping on it, or saying it's the greatest movie ever made. Go watch, whatever. I can't think of a smaller film right now, but go watch a smaller art house film right now. Yeah. Get a screener for something, or go to a press screen for it. And so that's why I have a hard time taking anybody who's that upset, that serious, because you don't have to do it. You're choosing to do this to yourself. Yeah. It's I'm not saying you have to like every movie that comes out, but there's an intellectual dishonesty in film reviewing now, and it's actually started with Ain't It Cool News, unfortunately, which was And it existed before that, because the big controversy in film criticism, and Ebert got a lot of flack from this from people like Pauline Kael, was the junkets.
Yeah.
And the international junkets, what they used to do is when they would debut a movie, they would essentially pay for a giant frickin' smorgasbord at a beautiful palatial hotel, and they'd have buffet lines, and you'd meet the stars, and you'd hobnob, and you have dinner with them, and they'd give you thousands of dollars worth of what we now call swag. They just would load you up with a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And it gave you an opportunity to interview the stars of the films. It was less structured than the press junkets of today. But you could sit down, you could have lunch with whoever, Bart Gable or Jimmy Stewart, and this was a trend that went on forever and ever.
Oh yeah.
And it was still going on in the 70s and the 80s. And you get to hobnob, and you meet the producers, and you do this and that. And there were film critics who said, you shouldn't go to those because you're being bought, whether you know it or not. Subconsciously, it's affecting how you're going to react to that film, either more favorably or disfavorably, right? Like, because let's say you have a bad time at the junket, a bad time at the party, that somebody doesn't show up for their interview. Are you gonna, then they would have a screening at that soiree of the film, and you'd go for the weekend, sometimes internationally.
Yeah,
you'd go overseas. You'd go to freaking Monaco to watch some mediocre movie, and but just for the chance to be able to have, delicious food and be able to sit down with Clint Eastwood or something like that. And Ebert was famous for going there and hobnobbing with everybody. And so people looked at him as being a sort of a paid for, in the pocket of the studio's film critic. Because Pauline Kael was famous for, I believe it was Pauline Kael. She was famous for, she wouldn't go to press screenings. She bought a ticket with her own money, wouldn't even ask for it to be reimbursed, because she said that, movies were a reprobate discount art form. They were not a real art form. It was a bastardization of art. And so you needed to go to the dirtiest, filthy movie house you could with actual common people and hear their reactions. And that tells you whether or not the movie's good, plus your own instincts and so forth and so on. But if you're just going to a press screener, everybody's sitting there silently with their notepad trying to get a review done by deadline, what the hell is that going to tell you?
Yeah.
You have to go where people aren't there because it's their job. And now people are going to quote unquote press screenings, but they're influencer screenings.
Yeah.
And it's a bunch of YouTubers. And again, nothing against it, but it's the same thing. They're trying to come up with their hot take, and to be the first person to get published and get the thing out on Letterboxd, and so they can link to the YouTube. But it's just this mad scramble for attention, because we live now in a not an information economy, but an attention economy. Who can get attention fastest, because it's so fleeting. And if that's who you're watching movies with, you're bound not to like most movies. I mean, sorry to say.
Yeah.
Because it's just, so I would just encourage, I know there are people who have podcasts and so forth who listen to you. I would just encourage more podcasters to watch less movies they don't care about, to watch more movies that are off the beaten path. It's hard to say, hey, forget your downloads, but most of us aren't getting downloads anyway, so forget it.
We're all getting downloads from each other. I mean, that's
correct.
the thing.
Do what you want to do. And when it comes to new releases, if you cover new releases, don't go watch movies that you don't think you're going to like.
Yeah.
Because nobody's going to be like, oh my God, where Cinema Toilet Divers didn't put out their latest Indiana Jones review. And I apologize if there is a Cinema Toilet Divers, but that was the trend for podcasts for a long time, was to be like, shartfartfuckmovies.com or whatever. Like, just nobody's dying to hear what you have to say about movies for the most part. Unless you're corporately owned by Spotify. Yeah. So and even then, most people don't give a shit. So most people are going to look at the commercial and go, that's great. I can't wait to rent that on Amazon Prime Video, or that movie looks good. I can't wait to watch that on Disney Plus. That's what the average person thinks when they see movies. They don't give a shit about the rest of us. Where you're perseverating over a bunch of things literally nobody gives a fuck about except for you. And you're in a bubble of people who are just like you, and they were perseverating and hand wringing all the time. And oh, when are we going to make adult movies again? Oh God, oh my God, when are we going to grow up oh, they're just all they do is they make movies for children anymore. Man, they've always mostly made movies for children because it's a medium for the most common person.
Yeah, it always.
That's what it is. It always has been.
It always has been.
The only difference is, Brian, you used to be a child. That's the difference.
Well, and the thing is, it's like, look, A Trip to the Moon was not high art at the time.
Correct.
It was revolutionary, but it wasn't high art.
It's a special effects roller coaster. Yes. That's all it was, a spectacle.
It was for everyone.
Yes.
For, like, seriously, if you seriously think that, art, the movies at any time have just exclusively been about high art, it's like, yeah, you're looking at film completely wrong.
You're looking at less than 1% of all movies that have ever been made.
Yeah.
That period. You're neglecting 99% of every movie that's been made, including the ones that have destroyed we don't have anymore.
Yeah.
You're not with it. And that's what bothers me the most is I hear so much of this. I just see so much of this stuff. And I'm like, man, you guys. I guess what frustrates me the most is I see certain people, no names, please, say, man, we started this at the same time. And I've been changed for the better, I think, by this experience. And I've seen a lot of people just get bitter.
Yeah.
And it's like, just stop.
Yeah.
Go do something else. Find a different hobby.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay not to talk about movies on the internet.
Yeah.
Talk about sports. Be bitter about sports like Brian is. Talk about the Atlanta Falcons or the Cleveland Browns, for God's sakes. Move on with your life. So, I don't know. I guess we should probably get to your actual episode, right?
We probably should. Yeah. I mean, we've already got like a normal episode of somebody else's podcast discussion here. I did want, but before we do get to our subject, you brought up your John Woo episode, which I do love the discussion that you and our mutual friend Carlo from the Movie Loot had.
You want to know something, Brian? I wanted to do that episode for a very long time. Finally got to it. Episode flop. That's a flop. Not because I don't think it's a good episode. It's just nobody gives a shit right now about John Woo.
Yeah, I know, and hopefully,
and that's kind of the point of the episode.
Hopefully, and they should be because he's the fucking master. But
yes,
hopefully when his new movie comes out, maybe he'll start getting some clicks. But no, I did have one question I wanted to ask you about that.
Sure.
So if you haven't listened to it, be sure to check it out because of the fact that I love the conversation that Jason and Carlo have about Woo's work. And one of the things that I love about it is that both of you guys were kind of novices to his Hong Kong work. And that's actually very exciting. And the question, so you guys covered 4 of his more famous Hong Kong films as well as Hard Target.
His first American.
Yeah. And I was kind of curious, why did you choose Hard Target and just go right into his first American film as opposed to sticking with his Hong Kong work with like A Better Tomorrow 2 or Once a Thief?
I just wanted to see if the trajectory of what happens to somebody once they enter the Hollywood system, especially at that time. What changed, what didn't change. And I think it was going to provide the biggest contrast. If we had just stuck with only the Hong Kong stuff, there is a sameness to those movies.
Yeah.
He's very interested in themes of brotherhood and people on opposite sides of the law and the consequences of violence and all these sorts of things. And it's like, and some of those are very Christian themes because he is a Christian. Some of and he is essentially a religious minority in his place of origin. So that makes him kind of a little bit of an outsider. He's also, coming from Hong Kong, which is its own little culture, its own different culture. In Hong Kong cinema, which was very, very sort of out of step with American cinema for a long time. And then, but very much pilfered by Hollywood. And so it's like, okay, What happens when studio executives get their hands on John Woo, who's because all they're going to see is spectacle. They're not going to understand that spectacle is symbolic to him.
Yeah.
And then most of his movies are actually anti-violence, which seems ridiculous when you watch something like Hard Boiled, but they really are. That's his. And if you ever read an interview with him, his stance is he's a pacifist. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of the reason why after he left Hollywood, he really has not made a lot of movies, because even he said after 9/11, he just didn't feel like he could do that type of movie anymore.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's I mean, we're not talking about John Woo, but it's like I love, if you've listened to this podcast, you know how much I love John Woo. But
I guess you brought it up. My point was saying it was a flop. Was I don't regret doing it because it's something I wanted to. It helps me understand him as a filmmaker better. It also helps me understand 90s action movies better, because I could say off the top of my head, because I knew for a fact that Hollywood stole John Woo's style, and that's a lot of what you're seeing in the 90s. But to say that with any sort of nuance or depth, or really fully understand what the hell I'm talking about, and understand what they didn't translate, which is what they did translate was the artistry, the creativity, the innovation, and the pathos, for lack of a better term. So the episode is, I think, right now probably one of the lowest downloaded episodes of the current season by a good margin, and I don't regret doing it whatsoever, because I wanted to do it. So I would just encourage you, make more flops. Don't just stick to the stuff that is going to get the downloads.
Well, and the thing is, it's like that's ultimately why I'm grateful that over the past few years, the structure of this show has become the structure of this show, because of the fact that it's for me, it's about I want to explore film history. I want to explore subjects that interest me and interest our guests. And it's like the episode before this one was Cassavetes. And
oh wow, I didn't realize that when I name dropped him earlier. Yeah.
And it was a subject that
we're talking about the dad, right? We're talking about Nick.
John Cassavetes,
or John Cassavetes, rather. Yeah. Nick's the son.
But I mean, I asked my guest, who I hadn't, Chris Esper, who hadn't been on the podcast in a while, and I'm like, so what do you want to talk about? And he's like, I want to talk about Cassavetes. It's like, and that's kind of a blind spot for me. It's like, it's kind of a blind spot for me too. So we ended up watching Shadows and Faces and Woman Under the Influence, and we talked for a great deal about it. And it was great because of the fact that now that I feel like I have more of an understanding of how independent cinema in general expanded, and also kind of because Chris is a filmmaker himself, how it's kind of the same as it was when Cassavetes was doing it.
100%.
Yeah. But yes, to your point, and you've teased this discussion more than I have today in our pre-discussion. We are talking about sexploitation films. We're talking about quote unquote erotic cinema. And I wanted to share a Twitter interaction that Jason and I had back in January. That was kind of the genesis for this episode. So a friend of ours on Twitter mentioned something about Ravel's Bolero, the very famous piece of music that most people know from the Blake Edwards film 10, which was Bo Derek, which starred Bo Derek. And I made the comment, Bo Derek having a movie called Bolero not be the one that music is associated with makes my head explode, to which Jason responded, if Brian ever has me back, it must be to discuss Bolero.
We're not doing it.
And we're not doing it. But I mean, actually, honestly, that is a good catalyst for another point of discussion here, which is there are several movies in the sexploitation genre that are not really available.
Yes.
At the time, I think Bolero was on like Stars or HBO Max or whatever, was
Yeah.
whatever it's called now, but it's not available for streaming anymore, which is kind of why we pivoted away from it.
Yeah.
But, it's funny because of the fact that there was only one, we'll get to it, there was only one film of these three that we're talking about now that was constant throughout. The other two changed, and a big part of the reason is availability.
And by availability, we mean even physical media availability. So
physical media availability as well as streaming availability.
Yeah, 100%. So like you think, okay, well, they're not available to stream. Maybe I'll just get a Blu-ray or a DVD or whatever. And they're either cost prohibitive or even there just weren't very many like DVDs made of them, ironically.
Yeah.
And so even on the secondary market, they're very hard to come by. And I have the ability, to source movies on physical media, and I called around the country to places I knew that would have them, and they're like, man, and I it's funny because I called one place. I'm like, look, I'm not because I had a list of titles. We had like a list of potential ones. I'm like, do you have this? I'm like, I'm not a pervert. I am going to be reviewing these for a podcast, and I want to track them down. And I got the same story every time, which is if we do get them in, they are immediately sell out because they're so hard to come by.
Yeah.
And it's not primarily perverts who are collecting these. It's primarily film historians.
Right.
And film history, like students, hobbyists or whatever, because the sexploitation genre basically existed in this really weird window of time, post-Hays Code, during the sexual revolution. They're mostly known for being around the 60s. When we get into the 70s, they start to become known as sort of the European erotica film, like you said, Brian.
Yeah.
Whether that be Swedish or French or whatever, but it's a European erotica film. And they kind of became a little bit more mainstream in the 70s. These are not XXX titles. They're either rated R or single X. And the one that would probably be the most, if you want to say, semi-pornographic, or at least has that reputation, is Emmanuelle.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think if you put Emmanuelle out now, it'd either go to streaming as not rated or TVMA.
Yeah.
It's not explicit.
It's very tame. And, I mean, even
we'll get into it. We talked about Emmanuelle. Yeah. It's more so the perspective is more leering and perverse.
Yeah.
the male gaze, the gaze of the film.
Oh God, there's so much to talk about with regards to that film. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more conceptual, and it's more the way the camera looks at bodies that is more pornographic than the actual film itself.
Yeah.
And then the other two are sexploitation films, but they're not. I mean, one is just mostly boobs, and the other one is a female stunt double for what's her name?
Brooke Shields.
Brooke Shields, which we'll talk about because she's got a recent documentary. But yeah, so we ended up with these three: Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Emmanuelle, and the Blue Lagoon, because these are the ones that at press time were actually available to us.
And the thing is, it's like one of the things that I said to you was, it's like so the reason we touched on Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is because it's Russ Meyer, who is very well known for his TNA films and especially
busty
the
women
T
movies.
Part.
Yeah.
And a big part of the reason you wanted to touch on this one was because it is written by Roger Ebert. And
the only movie he ever got a screenplay credit on. I think that's right.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. And then we touched on Emmanuelle, which is the only one that really was consistent throughout this entire discussion. And then we were trying to think about another movie on the back end of this. And I kept throwing out some titles, some more well-known titles, and it's like, nah, it really wasn't sticking with either of us. And then I said something about, well, it's like, I kind of want to make this about looking at this genre from kind of a historical perspective. And you touched on the Blue Lagoon, and it's like that's actually not a bad choice, and it's
Thanks.
a really good choice. But and the thing is, it's like I saw it yesterday, and it was honestly the first time I'd seen it. I didn't see it when I was younger, but one of the things that's interesting is, you know, even more so than Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Blue Lagoon is very tame.
Very tame.
I mean, there's only one sex scene in it. It's mostly nudity. But honestly, even in that perspective, it's still worth talking about with regards to this subject. And we'll get into it because of everything regarding Brooke Shields and the way Hollywood tends to sexualize younger actresses. But so we're going to start with 1970s Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, co-written by Roger Ebert and Russ Meyer. The screenplay is by Ebert and directed by Russ Meyer. So the original film that you had put out for Russ Meyer was called Vixen.
Yeah, impossible to find.
Yeah, you were unable to find it. I was fortunate enough to find a Videodrome in downtown Atlanta for rent. And so I rented it, and it's like, wow, this is such a... And it was... it's like, wow, this is... His you know, it's like, say what you will about Meyer, it's like, he is somebody who certainly is... He's not subtle in anything. And, you know, it's like you really kind of get the feeling of then Vixen, but he's also somebody who really is very bare bones when it comes to filmmaking. And I mean, I think Vixen is a really big example of that. And I mean, so much of it is you can see the template for like Kinemax cinema to come like 30 years down the road in that one.
Yeah. Right.
But one of the reasons that will be a fascinating discussion is there's a lot of casual racism on the part of the main character. And it's like, the hell is this doing in here?
Well, he's a really complicated filmmaker.
Yeah.
Because,
and we'll get into it with Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, because I think that rewatching it, there's some complicated aspects of that movie too.
Well, okay, so let's start with this. Let's start here. There's a misnomer out there because it has the word exploitation, and that's taken on a profoundly different, profoundly different meaning, especially younger people on Twitter. So it's just still old men yelling at the clouds, kind of a thing. Sorry, Brian, but it doesn't mean that the actors and actresses and people involved in the movie were exploited. I think that's what people hear now. What's sexploitation? It doesn't mean they necessarily weren't, and we'll get into that whether or not, say, Brooke Shields was or not.
Yeah.
But what it really means is that they were exploiting a taboo subject that would be of public interest to get butts in seats.
Yeah.
So it's, for instance, blaxploitation. Well, they don't make movies with black lead characters at that time, and still very rarely do today. So you had filmmakers who were like, we're going to have a predominantly all African-American or black cast, and it's going to be a movie, oftentimes maybe even written and directed, starring a black person. And it's going to directly it's going to exploit the fact that they don't make movies for black people. So black people are going to want to go see those movies. The same thing with, traditional Hollywood films at this time, didn't have nudity in them. And if they did, it wasn't gratuitous, or they weren't highly sexualized films. That would change by the 80s, which is what pretty much killed this genre. But so pornography was not readily available. If it was, you had to go to a special theater to go see it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So what if you took a more conventional movie, but you had boobs in it? Well, guys or people, I should say, are going to pay money to come see boobs or violence or whatever, right? So you're exploiting people's interest in something that was underseen or taboo. It's all that it means.
Yeah.
Now, and what's ironic is a lot of the women, they were usually like large bust models, big boobed models, who did a lot of topless stuff and stag films and hygiene films and nudist films and all that sort of stuff, those are all things that you have to Google if you're over 18 that don't exist anymore. Sort of an underground market of independent cinema that nobody hardly talks about anymore. Or they did, they posed in Playboy or less scrupulous places than even Playboy. Most of them weren't treated very well. They weren't paid very well. But when it came to Russ Meyer, they still weren't paid very well because there was no money to make these movies.
Yeah.
But they will all say that Russ treated them very, very well. And that of all the people they worked with, that he was the one that treated them the most and asked for their input on the movie or this, that, whatever, their character. And he had a thing, and it's probably a fetish, for dominant women. Dominant villainesses, basically, with giant boobs.
Yeah.
And those are the movies he made with dominant women, killer women on the loose with switchblades, wearing leather jackets. They're going to go out there and slice you up, seduce you and slice you up, kind of a thing. And so initially his movies were all written off as just being sleaze. And then it wasn't until feminist film critics actually went back and looked at his movies. And there's debate even within feminist film criticism, obviously, but where they were sort of reappraised as being some of the proto-feminist films. So it's very interesting. He's a very complicated character. This movie, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, that we both watched, it was started off as a quasi-sequel to a movie that most people don't know, which is The Valley of the Dolls, Dolls Being Pills, which was this drug melodrama, essentially, about, falling into drug use and all this sort of stuff. And it was panned by critics and panned by people. And so they want to make sort of a quasi-sequel, almost parody of that movie by taking it even further into the absurd.
Yeah.
Because the original was sort of trying to be earnest, but was absurd because it was so ridiculous. And to the point where they have to, I think at the beginning and the end, distance it from that this is not a sequel to, and all the marketing ended up becoming, this is not a sequel to Valley of the Dolls. This is beyond the Valley of the Dolls. And for legal reasons, they had to completely distance themselves from it because they had no right to make a sequel to the movie. And so really it's like, what it feels like to me is it feels like Roger Ebert, who is not notorious, I shouldn't say notorious, is said himself in his autobiography, Life Itself, that he was always a admirer of large-breasted women. and he goes into great detail about his rendezvous with large-breasted women on trains in Europe and whatnot. It's him kind of making a parody of these paranoid, a couple of different things. Then, we have to go back to the real days of cinema. The 1960s band musical drama, which is actually almost a subgenre. Which
this goes back to the 50s. This isn't.
Oh yeah, it's true.
60s.
Yeah,
this is the 50s too.
Yeah. Josie and the Pussycats is almost a parody of that same type of movie. Than the early 2000s. But yeah, and here's what it stuck out to me, Brian. Cynthia Myers is absolutely stunning in this movie.
Yeah.
Plays the bisexual senator's daughter. She is absolutely gorgeous. Most of these women are gorgeous women.
Yeah.
The tone of this movie is somewhere between Studio 54, the one with Mike Myers, and Boogie Nights. Like, if you pitch this slightly different, there's elements in here I'm like, PT saw this, right? Like,
yeah. Oh, no doubt. No doubt.
No doubt. Like, this is fucking Boogie Nights.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much about this. Because, I mean, like you said, I mean, and it's wild to think that 20th Century Studios owns this movie. Because
technically
it is
Disney.
Distributed by Fox, so that means Disney owns this movie now.
Is this on Disney Plus overseas in the UK, you think? I doubt it.
Oh, no way. There's no way in hell. That would be, although, God, I hope it gets that way at some point. That would be awesome. They own the weirdest shit now that they own 20th Century Studios.
They
but,
certainly do.
That's why that merger was so hilarious for so many people. But no, I mean this goes back to 50s like band era. Like one of the things that I kept thinking about when it came to this movie was you watch Mystery Science Theater, right?
I've seen it, yeah.
Okay. They did an episode on this movie from the 50s called The Beatniks. And it's very much like that old, it's like overnight success, criminal becomes an overnight success singer and stuff like that. But his old life is pulling him back in and stuff like that. There are elements of that from this movie. And, but I mean, the thing that you gotta love about Ebert, and when you were talking about the opening, the title of the movie, I kept thinking about the documentary Life Itself, where Martin Scorsese's talking about it. It's like goes beyond the value of the dolls, goes beyond it. Just
right.
What is that title? But
right.
No, I mean you can tell that there's a I don't even know if it's necessarily satirical, but it's just plain silly tone to this movie right off the bat. And I mean, it stays that way for 110 minutes. It's absolutely insane.
Well, even the melodrama of it is insane. Yeah. I mean, it ends up devolving. It starts off as a movie about a small time band that catches a big break via an orphaned girl reconnecting with her estranged rich aunt who just inherited money from her grandmother's, the aunt's mother. Yeah. And she's this lost heir, but the aunt's lawyer wants to get his hands on the money. And there's gigolos that want the money. And then there's gender ambiguous Shakespeare prose.
We'll get to Ronnie here because of the fact that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to that ending.
And then you have, it devolves into a soap opera in the second half where this character's fucking that character and that character's fucking that character and this character's in love with this person, but they're sleeping with this person and that person gets hit by a car and the one guy gets so sad he throws himself off of the onto the stage during a live TV appearance and cracks his neck in the funniest paralyzation scene. I've never seen it. Somebody being paralyzed has never been funnier than in this movie. God. It is. And then where they jostle his neck around and no, don't move him. Yeah. Oh. Then he miraculously learns to walk and get out of his wheelchair just in time to stop the transvestite killer. Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah. The way this film loses the plot, I mean, there's nothing quite like it, and I kind of really love it. I actually did not see this movie until a couple of years ago. And one of the things I kept thinking about when it came to the movie was if you ever read Ebert's Great Movies review, one of the ones that sticks out to me was his review of La Dolce Vita by Fellini. And I couldn't help but think watching this movie, and I mean, it obviously has a very different tone than the Fellini in so many different ways. I mean, this is more of an absurdist comedy than anything, but I kind of feel like to a certain extent, I think there are elements of this movie in terms of being seduced by fame, in terms of, the way that we kind of lose ourselves in the circus that he probably was inspired by when it comes to La Dolce Vita, and he wanted to bring some of that into this story too.
Yeah.
I mean, it very much feels like a script written by a film critic. It very much feels like somebody who understands tropes and kind of wants to do their own variation on those tropes. And I think, it's like having a filmmaker like Meyer who, specializes in a very certain type of exploitation film you can. I mean, this really was if Ebert was going to write a script at any time, it really does kind of make sense that it's for this movie.
Well, what's interesting about this movie is I think it was released at Cannes originally, and it was the biggest budgeted thing that Russ Meyer ever worked on. I mean, this was like, I don't know, 10, 20 times the budget of most of his movies.
Yeah.
And, it was a huge failure commercially and critically, and was sort of a black stain of the black sperm. You will drink a taste of my black sperm. There's a black stain kind of on Ebert's career. It was something that everybody would always bring out when they were talking, when he would critique their movie. They'd be like, oh yeah, well, you wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how this played when it originally aired or it originally was released. But I would say now in 2023, I don't take it as an earnest film about the moral pitfalls of free sex LA in the late early 70s. I don't take it that way at all. I take it as a satire, a parody, like you said, a film critic who is kind of taking all of these B-movie tropes and A picture tropes, melodrama and all this sort of stuff that was, again, very popular during the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, and just taking it to its most absurd conclusions.
Yeah.
And it's interjected with a lot of boobs because of Russ Meyer and Ebert himself. But I think I couldn't help but see this through the lens of purity culture.
Yeah.
And here's purity culture, for those that don't know, is a phrase that's used to describe the sexual mores of typically American evangelical churches. In particular, it's existed before that, but it became very popularized in the 80s and 90s, and through books like I Kissed Dating Goodbye and This, That, Whatever, True Love Waits, and Purity Rings, and all this sort of stuff. And some people refer to it as crotch Christianity, because it's Christianity that's only concerned with your crotch and not the rest of your life. And I was just thinking to myself, as somebody who has watched a great deal of documentaries about the 60s, 70s, watched a great many movies from the 60s and 70s. Those are arguably my two favorite movie decades, by the way. At least so says Letterboxd. Those are my highest rated decade. No wonder those people who were in their 20s during the pre-AIDS, post-birth control, free love era, where the first time you could have wantonous sex without the fear of childbirth, and pre-AIDS, the heyday of American hoe-baggery. No wonder those men and women who then went on to from hippies or wannabe hippies to yuppies in the 80s and suburban soccer moms. No wonder those people were so preoccupied and so fearful of their children having any kind of sex, because they were the most debaucherous generation in American history since the Flappers.
Yeah.
The reason why purity culture is so obsessed with sex is because the boomer generation grew up primarily religious in America, left religion in their teens and 20s. Historically, the great shift came back to religion once they became middle class, acceptable, sort of late 20s, early 30s suburbanites. They went back to church, took their kids back to church, and were absolutely terrified that their children were going to have the same type of orgies and drug use. And that's where the just say no to drugs, all the stuff that we grew up with, Brian.
Yeah.
The fears about sex and drugs and rock and roll and all this sort of stuff. It's because they did it all. They projected all of their youth onto us. Has anybody ever reconciled that? Has anybody ever reconciled the fact that purity culture, which fucked up an entire generation, 2 generations of a
Multiple
young.
generations. I mean, it's still going on. Let's not act like this is in the past.
It's true. It's true. That purity culture has fucked so many people up. Has anybody reconciled? It's because those people were sexual deviants and they were projecting onto us their fears. They couldn't deal with their internalized shame, and so they projected it onto us and built entire cultures around their shame.
Well, I think, I mean, the boomer, and look, I mean, the boomer generation was the generation that, I mean, I think they were also arguably the last generation where whatever their parents told them about how to be successful in life came true.
Right.
They're really the last generation where that was the case.
But Brian, they're also famously known.
Yeah, no, not the case at all.
They're also famously known as the me generation.
Oh yeah, that
was their label when they were in their teens and 20s. And what's their number one complaint to this day about Gen X and Zoomers and Millennials? All they care about is themselves. It's just me, 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 me.
Yeah.
Everything baby boomers have to say about the world is a projection of their own. What's the classic line? They were born on third base and thought they hit a triple.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you just happened to be born during a time of incredible post-war prosperity in America, and you thought, and mostly because the greatest generation suffered horribly through all kind of calamity, and ensured that you would do better than them through self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
You ate it all up. And you're still eating it all up. You destroyed the planet, and you had orgies and free drug use and all this sort of stuff that you're so paranoid. Everybody else would honestly, they're so paranoid that everybody else would be like them, that we would somehow take away something for them.
Yeah.
And this movie, to me, is the height of both the absurd desire of boomers and the absurd fears of boomers.
That's a very fascinating read on that. But I also think,
and I like the movie, by the way. I thought it was hilarious.
I think it's honestly the best movie we're talking about this week.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
No, and that's the thing about it, because of the fact that and when you were talking about it in terms of parody culture, it's like when it comes to it, this does kind of feel like a parody, and it feels very much of a piece with the stuff Mel Brooks was doing with Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles. And I mean, in terms of making fun of tropes, making fun of ideas, but also, because, oh my God, the moralizing at the end of this movie is fucking ridiculous. But awesome.
The moralizing at the end is something straight out of the 50s.
Yeah.
The voiceover that comes on is like, it's no different than the added tact on quasi-moralizing at the end of Psycho, right? Where it's it's the same sort of shit. But what's hilarious about this, and I would say the difference, and why I think this is maybe funnier than some of the Mel Brooks stuff, is Mel Brooks was making a movie and Mel Brooks wrote punchlines.
Yeah.
This movie has no actual punchlines for the most part.
No.
The entire movie. And I think that's the disconnect. If you wanted to say that, you say, well, is this a great parody film or not? I think the what you could argue is that Ebert, it's so nerdy, it's so geekily written that the if there are punchlines, they're very obtuse.
Yeah.
And so the way it ends up playing is it almost ends up playing earnest. It almost ends up playing straight. And if you watch this through the lens of this is supposed to be a serious movie, then this is one of the all-time biggest turkeys ever. But and maybe it's projection, but I don't think so. I think it is I think it's mocking all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Even the way the characters speak, like the sort of semi-outdated, it's like a mix of outdated beatnik and hippie lingo, but it's in the 70s. Like, it's just the whole thing the whole thing is about 1 degree away from Austin Powers. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I enjoyed it on that level. I thought, I thought this is, yeah. One of the reviews for the film, which I thought was hilarious, is this was from Charles Chaplin from the LA Times. This was a contemporary review. Is a grievously sick melange of hyper mammalian girls. That's a great line. Obvious double entendres and sadistic violence. Hyper mammalian girls.
Hyper mammalian girls. I mean,
all of these movies are basically quote unquote dirty movies because they show nipples.
Yeah.
And they either feign towards, I should say 2 of the 3. They either feign towards or show same-sex attraction or bisexuality.
Yeah.
And because of that, they instantly become lurid. They instantly become dirty. They instantly become, there's something perverse about this. Why? Because a young girl is seduced by an older woman, because we see 2 pairs of breasts touch each other. The whole time I was watching this, I was just thinking, and even with some of Emmanuelle, I was like, is this that far off now from what you could see on Euphoria?
Oh, no.
Not tonally, but just nudity.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
People are eating ass on girls 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, we're just way past this. And so I think some of the revulsion that mainstream audiences had towards some of these movies, it's just, again, a different sexual ethic, a different sensibility. But what's hilarious is you have these older film critics at the time who are watching these young 20-year-old, Brian, the fact of the matter is everybody's horny when they're in their 20s.
Yeah.
People are horny, They experiment, they do drugs, or they drink too much, or they have too much sex, or they look at too much porn. Now in our day, that's when you have more freedom to explore your sexuality, and that's when people do it, typically in their early 20s. And when you have movies about people in their early 20s, or movies that are made by people who never left their early 20s, at least mentally, this is the sort of stuff you get. It doesn't matter whether it's happening in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s. Some of the first photographs ever taken are of nude women.
Yeah.
Some of the first movies ever shot are of breasts. This is just the world that we live in. I actually, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, I guess is Sexploitation. I feel like if it did have Russ Meyer's name on it, I don't know if it would have got stuck with that tag.
No, I don't know. Well,
there's a lot of boobs.
There's a lot of boobs. Yeah, there's a lot of boobs.
But not much. Honestly, not much more than boobs. You get a couple of butt shots, but there's not gratuitous sex. It's just boobs.
The thing is, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about all 3 of these movies is that so much of it is suggestive.
Yes.
So much of what we see in these 3 movies, and 2 of these movies are rated X, or were rated X.
Well, Emmanuelle, which is arguably the most hardcore of it, has a sex scene that they just, like an old Hollywood movie, they pan away from it. We see people wrapped up in blankets afterwards.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's like, what the hell?
No, I mean, and the thing is, it's like so much of, and think about the reason why they changed the X rate. Part of the reason they changed the X to NC-17 was because of the fact that porn had basically co-opted the X rating because the MPAA never copyrighted the way they did the other one. But, the funny thing, the hilarious thing is, so many people, when they think X-rated movies, when they think NC-17, they naturally think towards porn. But when you watch some of these movies that were originally rated X, that were originally rated NC-17, they're so tame now. It's ridiculous. The idea that, think of the first NC-17 movie, Henry and June. That movie's so fucking tame. There's nothing in that deserves an NC-17 rating.
Well, let's be honest. Most of those movies got that labeled either because they were made by outsiders of the Hollywood system, or the subject matter of a lot of those movies was you had same-sex issues, either sometimes tastefully, sometimes not.
And that's a big part of what it was with Henry and June. It was because of the same-sex aspect of it.
Right. You'll have same-sex stuff going on in those movies. Again, not always tastefully or in line with current sensibilities, but what we had same-sex representation.
Yeah.
Or you had people of color, or interracial relationships.
Yep.
All of a sudden, it's fine to show two people in bed, but if it's two women, two men, a person of color, and a white person, well, I don't know. I think we saw too much nipple.
Well, that speaks to the puritanical idea of the MPAA. Yeah. I mean, the MPAA is always it basically is, in a way, it's always been the Hays Code by another name. It's always what it's been. But yeah, no, I mean, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is genuinely entertaining. That's one of the funny things about that, is that this is a movie that, it's got a lot of boobs, it's got a lot of nudity in it, but is a genuinely entertaining ride to go on in this film. I mean,
it's one absurd scenario of melodrama stacked on top of another.
Yeah.
And you're like, what are they going to do next? And they just keep upping the ante of, where the hell is this coming from? Like, if there had been an evil twin that came back with a black mustache at some point in this movie, I would have believed it.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that Mr. Z, or whatever his name is, the fact that Z-Man, the fact that at the end of the movie, it's revealed that he's been... Okay, so on the one hand, it's a insensitive depiction of trans people.
Yes. I was going to say, it's like, oh my God, I have so many thoughts on that ending. Oh my God.
On the other hand, it's a woman pretending to be a man. I don't even know, she's not even so much trans as she's pretending to be a man so that they could be a record producer, so that they could be taken seriously, but they're still attracted to men.
Yeah.
And so she's battling the fact, Z-Man is battling the fact that they want to be a sexy ingenue and a seductress, sort of a Black Widow sort of figure, femme fatale, but they present hyper-masculine so they can get ahead in the record business.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand that there's humor and absurdity in that isn't directly... the movie... It's bad.
I will say that part is like, oh my God, that was such a cringeworthy part rewatching it, because of the fact that I'd forgotten about that, and But
I don't know, the joke there, if you want to call it a joke, to me, I would say, this is worse almost, but it's almost as if Ebert isn't even thinking about trans people when he's writing them.
Yeah. No, you don't get
he's thinking in terms of binary gender.
And he's also thinking about, what more can I add to this? Like, I've already got somebody in a Nazi costume. What more can I add to this that just it takes the absurdity of this whole thing up to 11?
Oh, well, yeah, the idea that, like, this random German butler bartender and this palatial hippie disco psychedelic party orgy scene is named after a real German war criminal. And the idea is that when he didn't escape to Argentina, he escaped to California.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, he's just not like that. Honestly, that to me was, I got the joke initially of like, oh, well, this is so-and-so. But he's really so-and-so. Isn't that trippy, man? Like, I got the joke of like, whatever, hidden Nazis in Hollywood. And what that commentary was, I got that. I was shocked that we then see him do a full Hail Hitler salute in a Nazi uniform at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
That to me was a little bit too far. I was like, oh, but it's a difference in sensibilities. At a certain point, though, you're right. He is just trying to throw as much onto the page to up the ante of the shock factor.
Yeah.
Paralyzation, getting out of wheelchairs. I mean, the fact that we, at the end, where the dude is laid out in his wheelchair on the ground and he can't walk, and Z-Man, I forget all these characters' names, maybe Peg or whatever, but she comes out and she's like, there's somebody dead in there and their head is missing.
Yeah.
And it's played for absolute horror. And within a split second, as she says his head is missing, dude in the wheelchair, his toes and his boots begin to move, and he starts to be able to walk, and the music swells as if into triumphant Disney Triumph music. And it's like, you're beginning to walk again. It is
Yeah.
Insane.
It's absolutely insane. No, and the thing is, it's like this is probably one of the cases where this is probably one of those cases, one of the most striking cases of a movie just losing the plot at a certain point, because you get away from the melodrama, you get away from the type of, it's like, small town band trying to make good in Hollywood and how they get corrupted and stuff like that. And then, of course, then you get to Z-Man's house at the end, which almost has nothing to do with anything.
Nothing.
Until Casey calls them and goes, "Oh my God, help me." And it's like, he's going crazy. And
Z-Man's going crazy. There are people dead here. Yeah.
But, yeah, it's one of the most glorious examples of a movie losing the plot in its third act that I think I've ever seen. And at one point, they even used the 20th Century Fox fanfare, which is hilarious in and of itself. I mean, it's a comment on so many things, but, and what type of music does this band play? Because it feels like it goes through 3 or 4 different genres, I think. Sometimes
folk, acid rock, psychedelic. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, the 60s were a crazy time for experimentation in music, but come on. I mean, very few people experimented quite like this other than like Bowie. But
and not in the same album.
No, not in the same album.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I really enjoy watching this movie. And the thing is, it's like, yeah, they're for everything that's cringy about this movie, and if you're looking at it from a critical standpoint, there are several things that you can point to where it's like, the performances are not really that good. Like,
yeah, but that's what makes it good.
Yeah, exactly, because of the fact that they're giving it what they can.
They're giving this leaden dialogue, this melodrama, with these awful performances, and some of this dialogue, I don't know how anybody could deliver it, even the best of actors. I would put this movie into the category of so bad it's good.
Yeah.
It's juvenile. It is.
Oh, completely. 110%.
It's somebody who has probably never done an illicit drug in their life trying to write as if they're writing this in a gonzo style, as if they're. It feels like Ebert simultaneously imitating and making fun of certain type of experience and movie that was, popular throughout the 50s and 60s. And because of that, I don't think it's a black mark on his record. I think it's an interesting little side note.
Mm-hmm.
Now that he's been gone for a decade plus, or just about a decade.
Yeah, it's about a decade.
Yeah, I don't look at this as like, well, you couldn't critique movies. Look at the movie you wrote. Because I don't know that he actually sought to write a good movie. I think he sought to write a gonzo movie. And that's what this is.
I think in a large degree, this is film criticism as filmmaking as film criticism.
Yeah,
it really, because, it's very much, I think, to a certain extent, in its own way, it's doing what the French New Wave did in their film. I mean, it's looking at
film. You're the first person to ever compare Beyond the Valley of the Dolls to the French New Wave.
I can't possibly be the first one, but I mean, maybe the first one on a podcast. But and look, I'm not saying it's half as good as any of those movies, but what I'm saying is, I think it's made out of that same impulse of commenting on things that they see in films by making a film about those ideas. And that's where I'm getting it. But no, I mean, it's, and the thing is, it's like, I do think there's a large, and we talked about Z-Man and how just outrageously offensive that portrayal and that turn is at the end to trans people. But at the same time, I mean, you can kind of feel like there's, for as much as this movie is kind of lampooning the moralizing of 50s cinema, you can also tell that there's some progressive elements in this movie too that probably comes from Meyer and Ebert.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's tons of gay sex in this movie, or implied gay sex, either out of desperation, quaalude addiction, or gigolo situations, or sometimes just mutual attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's definitely, if if it's an insensitive to picture of trans people, I don't think Ebert. I think it's a both and. I think it's an insensitive depiction of trans people through a modern lens, but I don't think Ebert is writing that character through the lens of that person as a trans person.
No, I would agree with that assessment. Yeah.
I mean, how many times? I mean, it's a very obtuse, nerdy joke.
Yeah.
Z-Man only speaks in Shakespearean dialogue for the most part, especially by the end of the movie, right?
Yeah.
When the classical days of Shakespeare, men played women.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the joke.
Mm-hmm.
And then the joke is it's a man playing a feminine figure. And it turns out the man has been a woman the whole time. So it's a reversal on the characters always talking in Shakespeare is a reversal on the old Shakespeare trope. That's what it is. It's just so, I don't even say heady, but it's a dork's way of thinking. I don't know how else to put it. It just so happens that it recontextualizes all of the whole movie. He's trying to seduce all these men. And you think, well, this is a flamboyantly gay character. And it recontextualizes that. It's like, it's actually not flamboyantly gay. It's a woman.
Yeah.
And if anything, it's a bit of a commentary on, if you wanted to see it through that lens, you could see it through the lens of it's a commentary of what sort of sexual forwardness is acceptable for men versus women? What sort of sexual forwardness do we expect out of gay folks versus straight women? Da, 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 da. So,
no, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think he's thinking in the terms that we're
I don't think so either. I think it's just something where you look at it now and it's very, very cringe in that way. Very cringeworthy in that way. But in 1970, people were not necessarily thinking about in that respect.
No, he's just trying to shock the straights.
Yeah.
And the irony is that Roger Ebert, it was like mostly a straight, narrow kind of guy. So, so to a certain extent, it feels a little try-hardish, but that's also part of its charm. It's like it's so ridiculous that it's like only somebody who had never participated in his life would write something like this. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It is written by somebody. It is a movie about sex, drugs, and rock and roll written by somebody who has no experience in any of those ideas.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like Reefer Madness.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great. So,
man, Reefer Madness is such an insane movie.
I would recommend Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Yeah, I would too. I mean,
our next film, I got issues.
Oh yeah, there's so many issues with it. And we'll go ahead and get into it. It is 1974's Emmanuelle, the directorial debut of the immortally named Just Jakin. Although I've always said Just Jackin, and let's face it, it's how it should be pronounced. I don't give a shit. That's how it should be pronounced.
It should be pronounced Just Jackin. Yeah.
But
okay, man. So this is maybe the most famous sexploitation film of all time, arguably.
Yeah.
This movie is so popular and so famous and was so commercially successful all around the world, in particular throughout Europe.
It's got almost as many spin-offs and sequels as the Amityville franchise.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because it's just a name, right? It's just a name.
Yeah.
It's taken from a book that was written by a Thai French woman that later was determined her husband wrote it, that they then also paired with Just Jacob for an erotic magazine called Emmanuelle. And essentially, it's like it was a travel log of this woman's journey, this Thai French woman's journey, allegedly, throughout Asia and Europe, and the travelogue was spiced with sexual escapades.
Yeah.
And so it was like, imagine Penthouse Forum letters in a travelogue style format kind of a thing. It wasn't just about sex, but it was heavily sprinkled by sex.
Right.
And it was a very, very popular book. And so then it got this movie adaptation. And because you can't really trademark the name Emmanuelle, the Italians who really wouldn't have mattered if it was copyrighted or trademarked. Italians don't care.
Yeah.
There's the Black Emmanuelle series that basically takes this same premise but adds horror to it, like giallo, basically. And increasingly so as those movies go on. And there's only, I think, 5 actual mainline Emmanuelle films.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
But there was eventually an Emmanuelle TV series, which is actually Sylvia Cristal turns for. That ended up being basically on Skinamax. And she's in some of that, but she's an older lady at that time, so she's recounting younger stories, so it's a different, younger actress. And then everything else is basically a ripoff, imitating. It's using the Emmanuelle name, but it's not an official Emmanuelle movie.
Yeah.
And some of those, so there's like 100 of these, but there are only 5 of them were actually legit. It's it's crazy. Movies used to be the Wild West not that long ago, even, especially if they were independent or exploitation movies. So
yeah.
So the screenwriter here is, I think, her husband and her allegedly, and Jean-Louis Richard. It is just Jacob, which I'm with you. I always want to say just Jackson. And what the sense that you get with this movie is, okay, this is the first time I've seen this all the way through. This movie could be made today very easily, and it would be either one movie or 2 movies. You could either make this a lesbian period piece drama that everybody just dies over during Oscar season. All the real film critics who love real movies about adult, they love when 2 lesbians or 2 women are attracted to each other, but they have to remain chaste and can barely touch, and it culminates in a kiss. They love Merchant Ivory lesbian pictures, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, etc., etc. Every year we get about 3 of them.
Yeah.
So that people just love that. They love all of them. The end of this movie could be an A24 or neon horror picture. It could be an Ari Aster movie. Mm-hmm. It could be a Ty West movie, for that matter.
Yeah.
Because I find the end of this movie, not just what happens and what men do to Emmanuelle, but also that last scene of her in that rattan chair, painted up like a French whore, which is the idea. She goes from this innocent to this, and she's in this absolutely perverse, destructive relationship with this older man, even more so than her original marriage.
Yeah.
That's horror to me. I don't know if the movie knows that's a horror movie, but
no.
Her looking at herself in the mirror.
We'll get to that, but no, I don't think. Well, it's going to be interesting because of the fact that there's.
Did you take it that way? The last 20 minutes of this, it was like a horror film.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about the last 20 minutes of this movie because I got issues with it. But no, it's going to be interesting because this movie is supposed to be. We're supposed to get a new version of this story from Audrey Diwan, whose last film was Happening in 2021, and if you haven't seen that is about a student who is facing an unwanted pregnancy in 1960s France, and it's at a point where abortion is illegal. Absolutely harrowing and profound movie. I'm gonna be if this movie does end up getting made, if she does end up getting her version of Emmanuelle made, I'm very curious, having rewatched it, what direction it's going in.
Okay,
and
so
a big part of it is that ending you're talking about.
Well, let's take that first part before it goes, in my opinion, into a horror movie. The basic idea, and I think this is really interesting. Okay, so this is one of the most successful French films of all time. That's not an exaggeration. Yeah. It is one of the most successful French films of all time, and it's certainly as an export to foreign markets. Mm-hmm. To me, where it starts off as basically is modern European sexual ethics that scandalized American sensibilities.
Yeah.
It's about open marriages, sexually active women, women with sexual autonomy, bisexuality, female masturbation, things that America has always pretended didn't exist and that Europe has always known that has existed. And if what you wanted to say is that this is, if you took the plot and said, okay, this is about a younger woman who's married to an older man and basically is absconded with because he's a diplomat in Thailand, and he takes this younger woman, this younger European woman who's 19, and he's probably in his 40s, I would imagine. Yeah. And he takes her off to Thailand, and he lives with these other ambassadors and emissaries and cultural attachés and whatnot. And they're basically engaging in sex tourism, and they're engaging in open marriages, and because they're bored, they're sort of bored aristocrats. They're debaucherous aristocrats. All they do is get together and hate each other and snipe at each other and then drink and swap partners and whatnot. And there's this innocent who is put into that world. And the husband claims he wants her to have, I don't own you. Yeah. This isn't the old patriarchal system of marriage. I'm free to do whatever I want. You're free to do whatever you want. And there's the scene where at certain points she's begging him to just, can't our marriage be about something more than sex?
Yeah.
Can't there be a better, she uses the term absolute. Can't there be a bigger absolute than just pleasure? Can't there the absolute be the things that we share in common and the things that we know about each other and so forth and so on? And he just dismisses her out of hand. He's like, pleasure is the only absolute. Mm-hmm. There are no other absolutes. There's nothing greater than pleasure. At that point, he comes off as like Pinhead or something. He comes off as a sexual sadist in a way, right? He's like, I don't want to know you. I don't want to know anything about you. I just want to use you for sex. And later he's confronted by one of his friends who's like, well, because once Emmanuelle does start to be free and she falls in love, or at least has a crush or is smitten with an older woman, his friend is like, well, you told her you wanted her to be free, but you just really wanted yourself to be able to be free, and to be able to toss her aside whenever you didn't want her anymore without feeling guilty about it. Mm-hmm. If the movie had been about that, if the movie had been about the trend of older men marrying younger women for their sexuality, and this is a modern sensibility, this is a 2023 sensibility, or how sexual freedom and sexual autonomy is often exploited, mm-hmm. which people are not fucking ready to have that conversation.
No.
But it's a very real thing. How free sex, or like, oh, well, I don't own you, you're free to do whatever you want. Basically, non-monogamous relationships, how toxic those can be. Then you have a great drama, because then when she falls in love with this woman, the woman does the same thing to her.
Yeah.
The woman uses her for sex, and afterwards is like, she's like, I love you. She's like, you're young. Yeah. Eventually you'll realize you don't really love me. You don't even know who you are. You got to figure out who you are. I certainly don't love you. Get out of my house. And then she's heartbroken. Mm-hmm.
That sequence, and I agree with you 100% on that. And I will say that sequence when she first really starts to have some agency in the movie, and she goes up to B, she wants to talk to B, she wants to spend time with B, and you see the jealousy on her husband's face. Because she is, for the first time, using her own agency to do what she wants. That is easily the best part of the entire movie. That is the best stretch of the entire movie, because it is getting to what you are talking about and what this movie ultimately would be better for if it was about that.
The problem, Brian, though, is the movie has to stop every 10 minutes like a porno.
Yeah.
To throw in a scene of some girl masturbating to a picture of
Paul Newman. Yeah.
Paul Newman. And her age is that was like, she's portrayed as a child.
Yeah.
She's supposed to be younger than Emmanuelle. Emmanuelle's only 19. So this is an
Yeah.
underage girl, ostensibly,
Mhm.
that we're watching masturbate to Paul Newman. And it's not explicit. Her hands are just in her pants. But still, that made me uncomfortable.
Yes.
And what makes me uncomfortable about it is you could shoot all of this stuff in a matter-of-fact kind of way, which really Blue Lagoon kind of does,
Mhm.
and Beyond the Valley of the Dolls kind of does. But the camera lens for this movie, the leering male gaze, it is so evident that despite, however progressive or interesting the some of the concepts of the first half to three quarters of this movie are,
Mhm.
the movie ultimately has a pornographic gaze.
Yeah, it does.
The fact that there's a same-sex scene where a woman is basically coming on to Emmanuelle. Emmanuelle's not interested in her at
Yeah.
all. And then essentially by being forced by the ideas of her husband, ends up having sex with this woman, or allowing the woman to have sex with her.
At a racquetball court.
Yeah.
In a racquetball court, by the way.
Yeah, seems to kind of enjoy it, but not really. And
Yeah.
isn't really into it. That's interesting to pursue. Like, what if you just want to be in a monogamous relationship, but you don't have autonomy in the relationship because you're so young and impressionable, and somebody is pushing you into exploring areas that you're not comfortable with because she doesn't know who she is.
This movie should ultimately be about a woman who has been pushed by her husband into having sexual interactions
To be a libertine.
that are ultimately have less to do with her desires than his.
Bingo.
And then all of a sudden she decides, you know what? I'm going to go after my own passion, my own pleasure. And using her agency for the first time in her life. And he can't help it. And you're right. That if the film had just gone about it in that way and explored what that dynamic would look like, that would have been an interesting movie. But
yes. Well, instead, where the movie goes,
it's like here's the thing I will say: Josh Jakin is not an untalented filmmaker.
No.
He's a pervy filmmaker. He's not an untalented filmmaker. This is a halfway decently made movie. It just has it just has a horrible perspective to it.
That's the biggest problem with it. Yeah, is some of this, like the scenes at the waterfall, or some of the scenes. So a lot of the non-sex stuff is shot. First of all, they have beautiful locations, obviously, in Thailand, and we have to say a couple of things. The movie is really, in my mind, could really be bifurcated in almost two movies. That drama that's about a woman being given false sexual autonomy, and the way that story should end is she gains actual autonomy, like you're saying. Whatever that looks like for her, right? Maybe that for her is being single. Maybe that for her is being in a monogamous relationship with a different person. Maybe that's whatever that is, but that story never gets finished here. Then there's, to me, what I feel is like a complete horror movie, which is the complete disassembling of Emmanuelle as a person, which could also be your end, right? It could go in that horrific direction of, if men keep pushing her, this is what she's going to become. Is this woman is completely disassociated from her own self. That's horrific, but there's a message there.
And
there's a message there. But then there's this other thing that we have to talk about, that Josh Jakin did not shoot all of this movie, nor was certain scenes of this in the screenplay.
Yeah.
They didn't feel that there was enough sex in this movie. So more sex was added, and in particular, more scenes shot with Thai people.
Yeah.
And Josh Jakin did not know that was in his movie until the premiere of the film at Cannes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that we would be remiss to say that the biggest, despite the pervy look of it all, it's almost like a high sensibility, high art French film that devolves into porn, or softcore porn at the very least.
Yeah.
Every about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And it goes back to being basically just a French drama.
Yeah.
And then it ends very horrifically. It goes full on exploitation horror film. Honestly, parts of it feel like a cannibal movie.
Mm-hmm.
But then intercut into those things are horrific depictions of Thai people. And I find it to be, that's the most morally dubious thing about all of this, because anytime sex is presented amongst the French, oh, it's so high-minded. It's just so, they have these philosophical speeches about sexual attraction and pleasure and love and autonomy and the body and the this and that and the curves of a woman and woman on woman love. It's the most natural thing, blah, 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 blah. Then smash cut to any depiction of Thai people. It's almost always in the context of rape, of a man raping a woman, or a woman being sexually exploited by a French man, and not from the perspective of look how horrible it is what the French have done to the Thai people. From the perspective of these people, they just exist to be our servants. They exist to be trafficked in. They exist for our sexual pleasure. It's pure sex tourism, down into the point where they basically go to a donkey show in Thailand, and there's this scene where a woman has a cigarette and she's blowing smoke out of her vagina.
Yeah.
And that was filmed by somebody completely different because they wanted more shocking, gratuitous sex in the movie. So almost all of the Thai stuff, almost all of it, it was shot by somebody else and just inserted into the movie. And it is horrific. It's horrible.
It's atrocious. And
it needs to be repudiated.
Yeah.
Period.
It's absolutely
racist.
awful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think, that again, the French or the European versus Thai portrayals shows absolute sort of a mind of ethnic superiority. When when a man takes his wife to bed despite her protests, it's because that's part of the game. It's it's part of romancing your wife and giving her pleasure, and you're experiencing the ultimate pleasure together, and it's da-da-da-da-da. But when it's two Thai servants and a man is chasing a screaming woman through the jungle to bed her down and to basically rape her, well, that's what they do because they're animals. And that's what you feel like the movie is saying to you. And that's ridiculous.
It is. Yeah.
The biggest, most monstrous animals in this movie are the French bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure the movie's aware of that.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
So much so that by the end, Emmanuelle ends up in a relationship with an even older man who forces Thai people to Muay Thai box almost to the death to see who gets the right to sleep with her, which is not his to give away.
No.
He throws her into a situation of essentially gang rape.
Yeah.
But we're supposed to be okay with it because she seems to enjoy it.
And
that's the ultimate. That's her ultimate sexual awakening.
Yeah, and the wild thing is, especially with the gang rape, you get no, she clearly doesn't. Now, I mean, with the post boxing one, it's like they try to play it off that way, but even then, it's horrifically exploitive. And I mean, in a way, the only way. I think that entire sequence with Mario at the end is completely unjustifiable, and this movie, if it had any respect for the type of story that it starts out as, it wouldn't have gone in that direction anyway. But the one thing I will say about it is it feels like. Because, I mean, her husband basically approves of him taking her.
Yes.
And so this is basically her husband punishing her for having some agency to her romantic life. Which we've already seen doesn't work out well for her because of the fact that she's emotionally hurt by it.
Oh, she's devastated.
And I mean, that's ultimately this film's point, is that, it's like, don't take, if you're a woman, don't take any agency in your sex life because otherwise you will get hurt. You have to do what your man said. It's essentially what this movie is talking about.
Well, his advice to her is like the only way to get over it is to get even, and the way that you get even is you go have sex with anybody, somebody who doesn't matter to you, and you give them pleasure, and that way, wherever she is in the world, she'll feel it and she'll know that you've moved on without her. All this bizarre stuff.
Yeah.
Then again, he psychologically is forcing this now entirely distressed person into having sex with somebody she's already rebuffed.
Yeah.
Who does not want to have a conventional sexual relationship with her. He wants to be a voyeur. And then by the end of the movie, lays down a rule to her that one cannot have pleasure outside of the partnership. Like, it gets real bizarre. And she can't have any sexual pleasure unless he's present. And she can sleep with whoever she wants as long as he's there.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wildly puritanical look at sex for a movie that's filled with sex.
But Brian, the editing, the way it's edited at the end, where you just see like these quick cuts of all of these menage a trois that they're having, and Emmanuelle sort of trapped in between him and another woman, or him and another man. It's like it goes complete psycho horror movie to me at the end. It just played, and then her at the end just sort of staring off that 1,000-yard stare, looking in the mirror, and just painting herself up as he's calling her and like she's got some voiceover of like, maybe one day, like maybe Mario is right, and maybe this is the key, and maybe I'll be able to experience love again if I just do what Mario says. Yeah. That's the end of the movie. To me, again, I don't know if it's intentional, but it's like, I see that if you could recapitulate this movie and take all the Thai stuff out, all the real gratuitous stuff, have commentary on the fact that the French are sexually exploiting young Thai people, and have commentary on these libertine ideals that are supposed to equal ultimate pleasure and happiness, can be another system of control and destruction, just as much as puritanical sexuality can. Then it wouldn't. It's a more modern sensibility sort of film, and it's more of a drama horror movie of some kind, a psychosexual dramedy, not dramedy, but psychosexual drama horror film. But that's what I think this is. I think whether they know it or not, I think what they've made is a movie that starts off like a high-minded penthouse letter of like, oh, I went to a foreign land and I fell in love with a woman and we had sex under the waterfall, and you're sitting there reading a body letter about two women having sex and like, ooh, how titillating. And then it just turns into me an absolute horror film.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, honestly, talking about it we've been more explicit than the movie necessarily is, because when you say out loud what happens in the movie, it sounds more explicit than it actually is presented in the movie.
Yeah, the
directorial gaze of this film is perverse.
Mm-hmm.
And I will never revisit this movie again. I think it's a morally deplorable film.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to remake it, I think you gotta have a female director take this head on. Because again, as we've said ad nauseum, some of the central ideas in the movie, it's just a drama. It's just a drama that we've seen before. So you could do that. You could tell a captivating story. It's just, you're constantly feeling, no pun intended, like some guy somewhere is just inserting his own lust into the film, and it's supposed to make me feel licentious and like, ooh, and it just doesn't. It makes me feel really gross in a way that Beyond the Valley of the Dolls never did. So,
absolutely.
Gross
movie. And the thing is, it's like, look, this is Emmanuelle, for the most part, is basically ground zero for like Red Shoe Diaries and shit like that.
Bingo. It's Skinamax. It's the original Skinamax.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. But no, I mean, that's why I'm so curious about the remake or the new adaptation of it because it is a female director. So and the way that she did Happening, which I think is on, it might be on Hulu, but it might be on one of the streamers if you get a chance to watch it. It's a really harrowing film, but it's well worth checking out, especially in a post Roe v. Wade world. It's well worth checking out. But yeah, that's why I'm curious about if she gets to make that movie, what is it going to look like? How different is it going to be compared to what we see here? Because yeah, I'm with you. It's like I can't imagine ever rewatching this. And the thing is, it's like the filmmaking is what the filmmaking is. I mean, it's the French stuff is at least quote unquote tastefully done, but the thing is, the perspective of the movie is just so fucked, and that's the biggest.
That's the problem. That's the biggest problem with the movie is the perspective of it is fucked. There's no other way to put it. What's interesting though is this movie was so popular across the world that it, for a brief window of time, made Sylvia Kristel kind of like the ultimate sex object in movies.
Yeah.
And it made her a star.
Mm-hmm.
She would end up being cast in Hollywood films because of this. I think she was Danish or Dutch or something like that. But she stars in a movie that is probably equally as problematic, but not as equally explicit. And I think it's, Private Lessons?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a 1980...
82, I think.
81, 82 movie about she is a maid for a rich family, a housekeeper, and she is blackmailed by Howard Hessman, of all people, who is the family chauffeur, to seduce the family's 15-year-old boy, 15-year-old son, and the actor they have playing him looks all of about 12 years old.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, well, that's really weird, and that would be problematic enough. But this is a mainstream Hollywood release, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's in the 80s, and it's like, well, that's problematic. Yeah, it's problematic, but just wait for it. Then the movie becomes a June-September romance between her and this boy, where the nudity and the sexual contact escalates, they end up falling in love with each other.
Yeah.
And it's played as like, this is a romance for the ages. It's played like Harold and Maude or something like that. And it's so strange. It's the strangest, most perverse concept. And the tagline for the movie on the original poster is, "This should happen to you." It's a little boy on a stack of books because he's too short, kissing grown woman Sylvia Kristel, and it's "This should happen to you."
Yeah.
What should happen? I should be a 15-year-old boy who is sexually seduced by an older woman? Is that what you're saying, that this should happen to me? And see that this goes into this idea, this old school idea of, and this movie kind of has it, but obviously from a different culture. It's a different sensibility. But it's like, oh, well, you see, women are just as libidinous as men. And so if you put a woman in the right conditions, she can be just as sexually free and sexually debaucherous as a man. And watch Emmanuelle. Watch this young woman. It was parodied by Seinfeld as Rochelle, a young woman's sexual journey from Milan to Minsk. Watch this woman's sexual journey as she learns about masturbation and group sex and menage a trois and saying scissoring or whatever. And isn't that, oh, look at that. But it misses the fact that this woman is being forced to do all these things.
Yeah.
At the very least, psychologically, sometimes literally forced.
Mm-hmm.
There's no agency. And with this other movie we put her in, We make her this. Well, it's every boy's fantasy to be seduced by a older woman who's going to teach him the ropes sexually.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's statutory rape.
Mm-hmm.
That's sexual assault.
Yeah.
So as much as I want to kind of thumb my nose at the French and go, at least just Jacob, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why did you make this movie? Why didn't you take the story that's obviously here and bring it to a conclusion? Or why is there no self-awareness? All this sort of stuff. There's is equal amount as, and by the way, Private Lessons is not a sexploitation film. It's a comedy. It's a family comedy. So then you go to America, and we're just as fucked up, just in a different way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. So, yeah, Sylvia Kristal I don't think she ever really got beyond sort of playing
I don't think she ever did too.
But she was a well-known figure for a long time. Sort of like, what's the one before her that Bill Murray name checks in? Laurie Antonelli. You know, he name checks her in Ghostbusters 2. He says, I've got some Laurie Antonelli tapes. And basically just, you know, she was just a big-breasted European woman. And that was the appeal of her movies. I think what's most interesting is that Sylvia Kristal, I understand casting her as Emmanuelle as the virginal, innocent, I don't know anything about the world, let alone sex. And maybe that's the entire appeal of her. But then when Hollywood gets their hands on her, no pun intended, and it's like, this is the sexiest woman of the 20th century, that doesn't make sense to me. And beauty standards are different or whatever, but she's not a traditionally, in the world of the Raquel Welches and Bo Dereks and, you know, sort of the old stereotype for the sexual, like the sexual male fantasy, basically up until the 80s, and then now it's made a resurgence, but it was the voluptuous woman.
Yeah.
It was the woman with curves. It was Marilyn Monroe. Mm-hmm. That was the American sex pot figure. And this is a very not that sort of person. This is a very slight woman with a very slight frame. Very ethnically ambiguous. Like, what country is she supposed to be? French in this movie? I don't know. She definitely, you know. Again, I think she's Danish or something better.
Yeah,
Dutch.
I think that sounds right. That definitely sounds right.
But Americans don't care. She's just broadly European, you know.
Yeah.
She's got some kind of accent.
So
that makes
exotic.
her exotic. Yes.
That's the appeal.
That's what I was getting at. That's the other problem with this in the 2023 is that Sylvia Kristal in a lot of these movies, including the American ones, many of which were hits, by the way, she's otherized.
Yeah.
She's sexually attractive because she's exotic. Well, what makes her exotic? Well, it's that she's European. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And Americans, especially at that time, had this sensibility that Europeans were more sexually advanced and aware and knew the depths of pleasure more than us. And so that's, it's really, honestly, maybe somebody needs to follow up and do a documentary or video essay on Sylvia Kristal, because I wonder what her attitudes, she's not with us anymore, but I wonder what her attitudes about all this were. I wonder if we know, because she kind of is like Emmanuelle. She's plucked out of nowhere. She's turned into this ultimate perverse European sex fantasy.
Yeah.
Is sold to America as the ultimate sex doll, essentially. She's so naive and yet so willing. Like, that's the feel that you get. And so young, which, boy, that's oof. Yeah, they constantly refer to her as the nymphette and the kiddo and the child. I'm like, I don't really want to watch an erotic film where we keep referring to the main sexually active character as a child.
Well, I mean, that's the Lolita effect, though. I mean, that's really the Lolita effect, though.
It 100% is, and that's that is the entire, whatever you want to call it, the entire garment that gets placed on the shoulders of tiny 9-year-old Brooke Shields.
Yeah, and I was gonna say this is a great segue to our final film, which is Blue Lagoon, because of the fact that one of the things that one of the things that I really did not become aware of until I was older and I was an adult is the the hypersexualization of Brooke Shields when she was a teenager. And
Preteen.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
she was I think what 12 when Pre Baby came out, and she's
11 when she filmed
15
it.
in this.
She was 11 years old, and
Yeah,
well, we got to start there. Okay, so there's a documentary. It's on Hulu right now called Pretty Baby. It's 2 parts. They still have a docu-series, but it's basically 2 1 hours, so it's basically one documentary.
yeah,
And it's an hour and 10 minutes, maybe an hour and 10 minutes, it's about 220. And it's her sort of reckoning with her mom and reckoning with, especially at that time, but not limited to that time, the over-sexualization of prepubescent and pubescent girls.
hmm,
And the movie makes the argument, without getting too far into it, that when the women's liberation movement happened and older women started to be depicted in film and television as having sexual autonomy, and in society actually started to have some autonomy, the male gaze moved towards sexualizing young women because they were minors and they could not have autonomy. And it makes an incredible case because when you look at the archived interviews with a 7, 8, 9-year-old Brooke Shields and the sexual questions and the sexual tinge of the questions that she's asked by mostly male reporters on ABC, NBC, this is mainstream television. It is horrendous. And the newspaper headlines about her, of being, the world's sexiest child, and like stuff, like literally words that if you put it together, you just recoil because we never put those words together as bluntly as they did, without any sense of irony or without any critique. Eventually, it would build towards a critique, mostly due to Louis Malle's Pretty Baby, which I'm so grateful we're not covering here, which is a movie about a child prostitute whose virginity is sold away to an older man. And yet she's actually in love with a different older man who's like a doctor or something who frequents this bordello. And Brooke Shields was 11 years old and appears genuinely nude in the film.
hmm,
This film, it's a lot of camera trickery, and any real nudity that you see in the film is her 29-year-old stunt double.
yeah,
So the movie sort of has this reputation. This Blue Lagoon has a reputation. This is the movie where you see an underage Brooke Shields naked. It's not true.
yeah,
That's Pretty Baby. This movie is her stunt double, and she makes that very clear. And actually, ironically, Brooke herself doesn't really hold this movie in particular, in total disregard. What her problem with this movie is, the director, Randall Kleiser, who directed Flight of the Navigator and Grease, of all things, probably most famous for Grease, sold the movie in the press as, and the studio sold the movie as, you will see Brooke Shields' sexual awakening and loss of virginity, and the term he used, for real, on screen.
yeah,
It's less about the movie for her, at least as far as the documentary presents it.
hmm,
It's how the movie was marketed.
yeah,
Because she was famously an abstinent person,
mm,
well into her college years. So she always felt at odds as being presented as this like sexual ingenue, as somebody who was not comfortable with her own sexuality and was not practicing sex, had never had sex before. Her first kiss in her life was as an 11-year-old child with a man in his 30s on set of Pretty Baby. That's horrendous.
it's awful. It's atrocious. And
Now, so I recommend Pretty Baby to everybody. No, I mean the documentary, not the film.
right. I still haven't watched it, but I mean, I do want to watch it.
In concert with this conversation.
Yeah.
Because it has a lot to say. Now, her 2 teenage daughters absolutely wholesale reject Blue Lagoon and all of them, basically all of these hypersexualized movies, or movies that were at least marketed as being hypersexualized. That she made 3 or 4 of them in a row before she was even 18, 17. It's because their entire argument is, well, your mother consented to you taking your top off, you didn't. Your mother consented to you being sexually depicted in such a way, but you didn't. What's interesting about Blue Lagoon is Blue Lagoon was marketed towards teenagers, teenage female fans in particular of Brooke Shields.
Yeah.
Who at that point was arguably one of the 10 most famous people in the world. As essentially, this is a sensitive portrayal of a woman's coming of age, of 2 teens, first love, first sexual dalliances, et cetera, et cetera. And it is an adaptation of a much older novel. And it's sort of a Swiss Family Robinson sort of film.
Yeah.
Or story. But the two characters end up being 3, but one of them dies. The 3 characters get washed ashore for 2 children who do not in the novel nor in this movie need to be cousins.
No.
There's no reason why they need to be. And that's also part of the way the movie was marketed on. I was like, oh, but it's you're really going to see Brooke Shields lose her virginity on screen, which is horrendous. And also, they're cousins. You're going to get to see cousins have sex. That's horrendous. But the movie itself, outside of a few of those scenes, the entire time feels like a Disney teen movie from this era, or slightly before. Honestly, some of the sensibilities, especially with like the pirates or whatever you want to call them, and the boats, the this or that, Kit from Knight Rider, aka Mr. Feeney, all that feels almost. You're going to think I'm crazy, but it felt dialogue and score-wise and tone-wise, it felt like Don Bluth.
I can definitely see that. I mean, you're right about the Disney-fied aspect of this. I mean, you know, it's like if it wasn't for
it's idyllic.
If it wasn't for the nudity, you could see this easily being rated PG.
Oh yeah, so it's a very chaste movie.
It's so tame. It is ridiculous how tame this movie is. I mean, the nudity, such as it is very matter of fact because. Hey, guess what? They're stranded on an island. They don't have their suitcases with them. So it's like, of course, they're not going to have, are going to be.
Well, they also got stranded at stranded at 8 years old or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
15, 16.
Yeah.
They've outgrown their.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, it's.
There's more male, I forget the name of the.
Chris Atkins.
Yeah,
Christopher Atkins. Yeah, there's more, and he was of age. I think he was like 17 or 18 when
he was 18.
When they shot the film. So I mean, he could do his own He did do his own nudity, but
correct. A lot of the nudity of Brooke Shields' character is if most of it is below the neck, so you never see Brooke Shields' face because it's not her. Or it's at a distance, like her jumping into a pool or something, and she's nude. That's also not her. You can very easily tell because the woman jumps in and she immediately pops up close to the camera because it's 2 different things. I mean, the big thing is that you're going to see she's almost like Ariel from The Little Mermaid. Her hair is constantly draped over her chest. Yeah, but they try to do a good job of shooting her from the above the nipple, basically. Yeah, they do everything in their power not to show Brooke Shields actually naked.
The thing that I kept coming back to was the pastoral sequence in Fantasia, where you have when one of the questions that the animators had to ask themselves during that was how do you do the centaurs and how do you do the centaurettes? How do you portray the breasts and stuff like that? Yeah. And it's like, it's kind of in that same vein, but
the biggest, again, though, I have to go with the person who was in the movie and my best understanding of what their objections to it are today, right? Yeah. Because it's her experience. It's not mine. Yeah. I can't ask. I don't know what Sylvia Christel's feelings are about Emmanuelle, which is why I would like to know. But in this case, we have a sense to some degree of Brooke Shields, which is she got a lot of feedback from a lot of teenagers and young girls especially who were coming into puberty and whatnot. And the movie was sort of almost like a rite of passage film. It was a film that moms took their daughters to. I know that sounds odd, but they talk about it. They show the archival footage in the documentary of like this is your mom. Your mom took you out for the day and took you to the movie and watched a new Brooke Shields movie because it is sort of Disney-fied and chaste and idyllic. Then you have the talk.
Yeah.
You know, are you sexually active? The fact of the matter is, this movie would not be made today, should not be made today.
No.
And it was especially marketed to teen boys, and let's be very real, adult men.
Yeah.
As, you know, that sexy little girl, that sexy little teen girl from those Calvin Klein ads, which were, you go look at some of those Calvin Klein ads. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Horrendous. The amount of the positioning she's in, the crotch forward, nothing gets between me and my Calvins, which means I'm not wearing underwear.
Yeah.
And it's just her entire crotch spread open to the camera. The Calvin Klein ads are worse than anything you'll see in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And she's fully clothed.
Yeah.
And Calvin Klein's response when he was confronted was, what can I say? I'm a bad boy. She's 14. She's 12 in some of those.
Yeah.
The documentary is not rated because there is so much child sexualization and child nudity in it.
Yeah.
They do censor the nudity from Pretty Baby, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's a 10-year-old, 11-year-old little girl.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you realize, like, we, as American society, we've done this not just to Brooke Shields. She's probably, because she was such a huge star in a time when that really meant something. But it really, really opens your eyes, even more so if your eye, like my eyes are already open to these things, but it even more so opened my eyes to just what a distorted, perverted sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
Male directors, producers have towards the real bodies and sexuality of actresses in particular, and young actresses especially.
Well, and men in general too, because I mean, I remember, I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had websites devoted to the countdown clock for like the Olsen twins and Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan, and it's despicable.
Right.
It's absolutely despicable.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. You're exactly right, and it's. So you have to address all that up front about Blue Lagoon.
Yeah.
Right. So the only thing I would say is go watch Brooke Shields and find interviews and get her opinion on it. Let's take all of that and put that all aside, that this movie is essentially marketed towards teen girls as a sensitive portrayal. Go to your mom, learn about sex and the birth of the bees, and have the talk. And it was marketed towards adult men as watch Brooke Shields be deflowered.
Yeah.
Which is horrendous. Let's put that aside. The movie, as a movie, is horrendously boring.
It is. Yeah. It's deeply silly. I mean, I'll admit, it's like, I think if it truly had been interested in the coming of age aspect of Brooke Shields' character in this movie, of her getting her first period, which we get the implication of, and all of that aspect of it, and the fact that Richard, the Christopher Atkins character, is just kind of oblivious. I do kind of enjoy that aspect because it gets teenage guys about girls completely right, where it's like, oh, what the hell are you doing? But at the same time, if you look at it, it's looked entirely through the perspective of, when she gets pregnant in the movie. It's like, when are you going to be able to do it? And it's like, I don't know. And it's there's elements in that where if you really were interested in doing a story about that, are there. Like same kind of thing that we were talking about with Emmanuelle.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, it's just such a boring movie.
The vast majority of this movie is not about nudity or them two cousins falling in love on a deserted island. No. It's about them like picking berries and sitting around in the sand and trying to remember remnants of, since they were so young when they got washed ashore.
Yeah.
losing memories of the civilized world and kind of trying to. They're not quite Lord of the Flies feral children,
No.
though they should be. But they're sort of cave people. I don't know how to describe it, but it's sort of like it's supposed to be funny that they speak with these malapropisms and they get certain terminology wrong, and that they're growing up, but because they're not a part of civilization anymore, they're still very childlike in their mentality, and they're sort of simulating what they were sort of remember adults used to be like. Yeah.
Well, the thing that struck me about watching this is you've got this you've got this picture show, this slideshow of basically a wedding and stuff like that, a married couple and stuff like that. It feels
like human development.
Yeah, I mean they're basically taking their cues off of that in a large degree. But yeah, I mean it's so much. I mean it's not the same thing as Castaway, but it's kind of the same thing as Castaway, where it's like they're basically just they're trying to adapt to being on their own, and what does that look like? And you see this hut that they put together, which is the most extravagant hut I think anybody's ever put together.
It's Gilligan Islands. It's Gilligan's Island level of technology they almost have. Like you expect them to basically have like electricity via coconuts, like on Gilligan's Island. It's pretty ridiculous. Yeah,
it's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, here's the thing about this movie. The movie wants to have it all ways, right? Yeah. The movie doesn't want to realistically depict what it would be like for two small children to wash ashore.
No, not at all.
A mostly deserted island, and assuming they survive, deal with the psychological ramifications and the feralness that you would have. They don't want to go dark with it.
No,
they
this
also
is fantasy.
But they also want to be able to have indigenous people be savages, and to be offering human sacrifices and show human guts strewn on an altar. But then they also want to have Brooke Shields confuse that pagan deity with God.
Yeah.
And like they want it to be like this Disney-fied, Disney teen adventure movie where no adventure ever really happens.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also sexual enough that grown men can leer at it.
Yeah.
But it's also very, very much like a movie made with what adult men think 14-year-old girls want, which is just like romance with a dreamy boy.
Yeah. Well,
but it just so happens that boy is her cousin. Like that just doesn't make any sense. You could have done a teen romance movie here, Brian.
Yeah.
That's what you want to do, where they're older, they wash ashore where they're older, and they go from being friends to, as they go through puberty, they go from being brother sister tight, not literally by blood, God help.
Yeah.
But fighting, friends, like each other, whatever, to liking each other. And what do we do with these feelings? And he's a dreamy boy and she's a dreamy girl. And make it a more of that like sort of Disney teen movie. You could do that version and have some adventure, have some pirates involved, some swashbuckling or whatever, and you can do that movie.
Yeah. Which is not this movie at all. And
no,
I mean, even
it's sort of this kind of like, oh, but isn't he dreamy? And I got funny feelings about him.
But the thing is, it's like,
but it's your cousin.
And even at the end, you don't really get the feeling that these three are a family in terms of mother, father, child.
No.
There's no romance between them at all. It's just they're
they have no chemistry.
They're the only option. And I mean, that's basically what you're looking at. And
it's essentially a 2-hour movie where we're watching people give very dull performances of very dull material.
Yeah.
Who are supposed to be slowly transitioning from a childlike relationship to each other to a adult romantic family relationship with each other.
And you don't feel it.
And you don't feel any of it. And then it's lurid and disgusting and off-putting because one of them is an actual child and the premise is they're related, they're cousins, they're
Yeah.
first cousins. None of that's needed. None of that's necessary.
No.
And are they dead at the end? Presumably they're dead.
Well, allegedly they're not. According to somebody who finds them, they're not. But that's the other wild thing about this. There's no real ending to this movie.
No.
There's no real ending to this movie. It's like, so you're trying to leave us on a happy note of, oh, they've been rescued, but you also get the impression that, like you said, maybe they're dead.
Well,
so
yeah,
have
so we
somebody
should
come in and it's like, so yeah, you have somebody come in and say, oh no, they're just sleeping.
Mr. Feeney, aka Kit from Knight Rider, is Christopher Atkins' father.
Yeah.
And Brooke Shields' parents were missionaries who were killed in the mission field. So she's living with them now. And they've gone off to heaven, and one day she'll join them in heaven.
Yeah.
And they end up having a fire. They have these basically pirates that are trafficking them around. This is like turn of the century. And the ship explodes, and one of the scallywags, one of the pirates, Pappy or whatever his name is, and he grabs the two children to rescue them and puts them in a rescue boat. There's smoke and fog and whatnot from this horrible fire and explosion of the ship because all the gunpowder goes up. And so Mr. Feeney's boat and the kids' boat get separated. This is where it totally feels like Don Bluth.
Yeah.
And the kids are washed ashore with this pirate guy. And in the span of about 24 hours or a week or maybe a month at most, he teaches them everything they need to know to survive on this island.
Yeah.
How to thatch roofs, how to catch fish, how to do this, how to do that. And they've washed ashore with some things. There's mostly like some of his stuff, which includes like weird little stereoscopic porn and photos of families and whatnot. It's odd.
Yeah.
And he ends up getting really drunk on some rum they find because they find other people have washed ashore. They died there, and implication is maybe they were sacrificed by the natives. And so he says, don't ever go to this other side of the island. You have to stay on this side of the island. Don't ever go over there. Promise me you'll never go over there. And they seemingly subsist on papaya and bananas. Where they get water from, I have no idea. Fresh water. I guess the waterfall, I guess you
I think that's I think that's it. And
the Blue Lagoon. They get the water from the Blue Lagoon. Yeah. So anyway, he ends up dying, drowning, drunk on a rum barrel, whatever. They find his body as children, slightly older children, and they're horrified by it. And so they pick up camp and they move. And then we painfully watch as week after week, day after day, year after year, they never seemingly age, but they're getting older.
Yeah.
And eventually they discover there are people on the island. That it comes into play, none whatsoever. Okay?
Yeah.
They're all who are cannibals, and it's horrendous. And then at some point, Brooke Shields gets pregnant through incest.
Yeah.
And they have a baby, and the baby eats these berries that when they first landed, Brooke Shields was going to eat these berries. And Pappy, or again, whatever his name is, the pirate is like, Patty is his name. Patty's like, don't eat those. Those are go to sleep and never wake up berries. So don't ever eat those unless you want to go to sleep and never wake up. So they're not watching their kid whatsoever. And the kid wanders into the berry patch and grabs a bunch of berries, jumps into a boat. It's so convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
Brooke Shields then jumps into the boat after her. Boat starts drifting off. The kid loses one oar. Brooke Shields is trying to get the oar with the other oar. She loses that oar. Yeah. Christopher Atkins has to drop his bananas, jump into the water to swim after him.
Yeah.
A shark comes. He's going to eat Christopher Atkins. He beats up the shark. They get in the boat, but they don't have any oars. They're adrift at sea, and then they realize their baby has eaten these never wake up berries. And there's just enough left for the parents to kill themselves as well, because they don't want to, they're going to die anyways at sea. and the baby's dead in the boat with them. And now remember, this whole movie, everything I've just said is being presented to you with a Disney sheen all over it.
Yeah.
A Disney live action sheen. This is the softest, most family friendly, incestuous sexploitation film you ever watched.
By far the most risque aspect of this are the tattoos that the cook has.
Yes.
On his boobs and on his belly. Holy shit. That is the craziest damn tattoos I've ever seen in a movie.
And so then it just so happens at the same time they're adrift at sea, Mr. Feeney, who's already spotted them once, but is like they were covered in mud, so clearly they couldn't be his kids.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what he says. Well, that couldn't be them. Why couldn't it be them? Then he sees a little the dinghy or whatever from the ship that they're in. He's like, and ostensibly like 10 years have passed. What, you know? And he's just been looking for them for 10 years.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But he's like, let's go to that boat. So they row out to the boat. They find the whole family snuggled together in the bottom of this little dinghy, this little little rowboat. And they all look dead.
Yeah. Yeah, they do.
And he goes, oh my God, are they dead? And one of the pirates is like, no, sir, they're just sleeping. And is that a metaphor that he doesn't, and if so, what is that a metaphor for?
No, thematically, there's absolutely nothing of interest in this movie. It's played
with such whimsy. It's played with such like that is a euphemism that's like heartfelt for us to feel. I don't know what it's supposed to be saying. Are they dead or are they alive?
There's literally no thematic point to this movie whatsoever. There's
none. There's no point. There's no story.
This is such. And the thing is, it's like you were talking about selling the movie on sex appeal and stuff like that. Which, I mean, let's be honest, you're just selling it on nudity, and I think that's again, it goes. We're talking about some of these puritanical things that play into the way nudity and sex is considered in society. And I mean, this is one of those movies where, people get the impression that just because there's nudity in a movie, it's sexual. That automatically makes the movie sexual, which is not the case at all. Now, granted, there are moments where it is intended to be sexual in this movie, and it's still atrocious because of the fact that you're talking about teenagers. But at the same time, I mean, it goes to this. That's why this ended up, even though on the surface, Blue Lagoon doesn't seem like it makes sense in the conversation of this. It really does, because of the fact that, in each of these movies, we're looking at the ways that sex is portrayed in movies. And I love the fact that 2 of these are Hollywood films, and then we've got one foreign film. Yes. That was basically an international hit because of the fact that, we could have talked about far bigger movies than this. We could have talked about Basic Instinct, Wild Things. We could have talked about Bolero, and that would have been a completely different.
We could talk about Porky's, for God's sakes.
Yeah, we could have talked about Porky's. We could have talked about Private Lessons. And I mean, we could have talked about this from so many different angles. And, but I love that we're talking about in regards to these movies, because the sexuality and the nudity in each of these movies plays a very different purpose.
Yes.
And I love that this is such a wide range of discussions. And yeah, I mean, the fact that Blue Lagoon is so toothless in so many ways, as a story being told, as sexual exploitation, as so many different things, it's such a toothless film. Like, it really doesn't have anything of value to say in any of these respects.
No, the only thing it has to say is The only thing that it has to say is, here's Brooke Shields' body double.
Yeah.
You could pretend that you're looking at naked Brooke Shields.
Yeah.
At 15, which is despicable.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you market this movie on? There's no action. There's nothing happens. There are really no threats. There's no plot. There's really no story.
No.
There's no, again, if you want to make a coming of age romance film about two teens trapped in a deserted island, there's a story to be told there, but you tell it with overage actors, which is Hollywood's always done. Every movie with teenagers, they're always 40 years old.
Yeah.
So just have 20-year-olds be in the movie. But the movie was made because it was an opportunity to sexualize the most famous pretty girl in the world at that time, which is Brooke Shields. They didn't give two shits whatsoever about her or how old she was or what it meant to sexualize somebody so young. That's it. That's the bottom line.
And
then the movie itself is absolute, like you said, toothless, pointless, boring. Come and look at two pretty actors in a pretty location. That's it. That's all the movie has to offer you. That's it.
The most fascinating thing about the filmmaking in this movie is just how batshit insane Basil Pallador's score is. And
I was wondering when you're going to drop that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
My God. I mean, it's like there's sometimes there's scores that I'll latch on to that really, really vibe with me for some reason. Like Tangerine Dream's score for Sorcerer was the same way a couple of years ago. Peter Gabriel's score for Birdie. I kind of feel like Pallador's score for this one is the new one, just because of how absolutely insane it is. And there are times where it's like, okay, it kind of fits in with the film. It kind of fits in with what it's trying to do. But there are other times where it just goes off on its own into what the hell are you doing? It's like, are you just as bored with the story as we are? And you're just like, you know what? I'm just going to go to town on it. I'm just going to go to town, and that's fine. You're not going to reject my score because I'm Basil Pallador's, for crying out loud.
It is. He is scoring the movie that people thought they were making, not the movie that's on the screen.
Yeah.
It is this sweeping, sentimental at times, epic, sweet, classic Hollywood score. And it is being applied to two pretty things in a pretty place. That's what this movie comes down to. Isn't Christopher Atkins, isn't he pretty? Yeah. But Brooke Shields, isn't she pretty? Yeah. Well, isn't this island pretty? Yeah, Fiji's very beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yes. Isn't that water beautiful? Yeah, it is. That's it. That's all the movie has. And isn't it funny that they say those words wrong? No. Isn't it funny that they don't know what a period is and he thinks she's got a wound? Isn't that funny? No.
Yeah. No.
It's
one of those things where it's like, oh my God. I mean, you basically wrote these with abs. I mean, that's something where it's like, if I'm sure the written story, I'm sure works much better. And it's obviously because of the fact that the author can create narratives and trains of thought for the
inner worlds
that are hard to depict on screen.
Yes.
Because of the fact that you have to translate that to dialogue. You have to translate that into visuals. And I mean, Randall Kleiser's not a filmmaker who, yes, he did Grease, which is okay. He did Flight of the Navigator, which I actually enjoyed, but it's okay. But the fact of the matter is, it's like you have to have a filmmaker who's capable of projecting those ideas, and he just isn't.
Honestly, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how. I'm not familiar with the source material. I don't know how you could tell this story in a way that means anything whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think this is a story from a bygone era.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know if this is like a direct adaptation or a loose adaptation. I'm not sure, but I think that the entire sensibility of it. I mean, nobody sat there and thought to themselves, why do they have to be cousins?
Yeah.
Because that in and of itself is the entire time you never shake it.
No.
The entire time you're watching this movie and you're like, oh, these two young people are falling in love. I'm like, they're cousins.
Yeah.
They like I understand that they are the only two people they've ever known, essentially, and that they're the only sexual options for each other. This deserted island, they're going through puberty together. I get it.
Right.
But they're cousins.
Yeah.
Why is this movie made? And ultimately, the biggest problem with it is, okay, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls was made to shock and to kind of thumb its nose at the man and to make fun of overwrought melodramas like Valley of the Dolls. Got it. Emmanuelle was made to titillate men and with a patina of high-minded European philosophy, of sexual ideas. Okay, I got it. I don't agree with it. I think it's deplorable in its execution and its point of view, but I understand why it exists. I do not, for the life of me, understand why this movie exists.
What is its point? Well, you already talked about it. The only reason it exists is to sell on the prepubescent, the preteen, the teenage sexuality of Brooke Shields. That's the only reason it exists. And that
makes it the worst movie that we watched this week. Then. Yeah,
and not just and it's arguably the worst from a creative standpoint as well.
Yes.
I mean, it's just atrocious. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, because I mean, when you define sexploitation, I think that is you defined absolutely what it is. I mean, it is exploiting something that audiences were not necessarily used to seeing on screen. And I mean, even now we still aren't. I mean, it's always hilarious when you see it every couple weeks on Twitter saying, "Oh, there should be fewer sex scenes in movies." It's like, have you watched movies? Now they're about as sexless as you can get.
Part of me wonders if those are trolls.
They've got to be trolls. Up. I mean,
because
they're either trolls or they're projecting what TV shows do.
Because there was the one that was really famous not that long ago, which was like, it felt so trolly, but when the person was like, "I don't like sex in movies. Sex in movies is," what was the term he used? It was like traumatizing or abusive or something, because I didn't consent to the sexual activity.
Oh God, that's right. I forgot about that one. Oh my God.
Like, but it's not happening.
No, it is
fiction. Just because something is depicted around you doesn't mean it's happening to you.
On top of which, you paid for the ticket to see that movie.
Yes.
So what are you talking about? Oh my God.
But if I read a movie, remember that?
I forgot about that one. Oh my God.
A sex scene. I didn't consent for this to be happening. It's like, this is sexual abuse. I'm going, what in the hell? And that's where part of me wonders, you're a little bit older than me, so I think you're a Gen Xer.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound like, this is a good note to close on probably, but I don't want to sound like a guy who's starting to turn into a right-wing crank or something. But there is part of me that does wonder, in the political spectrum, an ideological spectrum, at a certain point you go so far left, you're right again. You can go so far left that you're back into puritanical thinking.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't want sex in movies. There's too much sex in movies because it makes me uncomfortable. That's puritanical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Sex is a normal human function. None of the movies we've discussed here today depict sex in a normal, healthy way. they're all meant to exploit our desire for sex,
Yeah.
and they're presented to us in a Blue Lagoon, sort of this hyper idealized, virginal, Disney-fied way, despite how horrendous it all is.
Yeah.
Which is as problematic, if not more, because you're presenting to us underage sex, incest, and sexual exploitation of a minor as if it's just a dream.
It was
what a
the
wonderful
ninth highest
dream.
grossing. It was the ninth highest
Huge
grossing
hit.
movie of 1980 too, as well.
So that's dangerous. And then you've got the sexploitation and the depictions of sex, which is ostensibly about female autonomy, but really isn't, in Emmanuelle. And then you've got just bonkers gonzo boobery, hyper mammalian women in the Russ Meyer film. That's not depicting sex in any kind of actual normal way. But for that matter, either is Euphoria or Girls or any of these hypersexual shows that are on TV.
Yeah.
It's always hypersexualized.
And the thing is, it's like, in a way, I mean, it's weird to say, but in a weird way, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is probably the most responsible in the way that it's portraying sex, because
of these three, yes.
Because of how over the top it is.
Yes.
And I mean, everybody's of age. You're not thinking about, oh my God, they're underage, and
they're all adults. They all look like adults.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes,
You're not thinking about that in that respect.
And it's all consent. Everybody's consenting to the sexual experience for one reason or another.
And that's the thing that is mind-blowing about this film, this trilogy of film, this trio of films. And I mean, again, we could have been talking about different movies. We could have been talking about Adrian Lyne's movies. We could have been talking about Paul Verhoeven's movies. We could have been talking about more Russ Meyer movies. We could have been talking about different filmmakers and how they approach sex.
But Brian, to your point though, those later movies, even the Lyons films and the Verhoeven movies and whatever, what's so interesting is the reason why sexploitation really went away is two reasons. And then the third reason completely killed it. One, Skinamax.
Yeah.
So a lot of these sensibilities, like you said, and it ended up on late night cable, late night
or direct to video.
Or direct to video.
Yeah.
There you go. That's another one. Or direct to cable television series, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Red Shoe Diaries and whatever. Real Sex, Taxi Cab Confessions, all that kind of stuff that was around when we were growing. There are other parts of it got absorbed into mainstream filmmaking.
Yeah.
Just like the fact that 90s thrillers basically are just taking the sensibilities of early 80s slashers and presenting them in a more presentable mainstream way. Basic Instinct is taking a lot of the bisexuality, sexual fluidity. She kisses men and women, and boobs, and all this. And it just, honestly, and in the boob stuff, it just ends up in the slasher movies by the 80s.
Yeah.
Gratuitous nudity, and here's the thing about America. America can only absorb sex if it's paired with violence or comedy.
Mm-hmm.
If we can laugh at it, we're not uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
So we get all the raunchy sex comedies of the 80s, thanks to Animal House in the late 70s. You get all the slasher movies, thanks to Black Christmas and Halloween, which are all riffs on Psycho, which is also sexual and whatnot, but doesn't show him.
Yeah.
And violent. So as long as it's paired with grotesque violence.
Yeah.
Or raucous comedy. Oh, it's all a joke. Which again, both of those are more nefarious, if you really think about it, in shaping our sensibilities. And if you just presented sex as a run-of-the-mill, relatively boring thing.
Yeah.
But that you can't exploit people's libidos. It was just like, well, yeah, the sex scenes are pretty. They're pretty realistic in the fact that it's awkward, and it's like, not everybody's interested at the same time. Some people it takes longer.
Yeah.
There's more foreplay for this person. That person finishes quicker. There's, when you start getting all that sort of stuff, you can't exploit that. So you have to present these hyper sexualized, bizarro versions of sex to the world. But I'd rather live in a world where at least we have the possibility of a female director taking on something like Emmanuelle than live in a world where it's like, well, we can't have that because that might offend somebody who pays to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which brings us full circle. If you don't like things, don't watch them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I don't like these movies. I'll watch Beyond the Valley of Dolls again, but I don't like two of these movies. I will never watch them again.
Yeah. And
I will also make sure that I don't go on a lifelong Twitter crusade against the fact that these movies exist.
Yeah.
My identity is now not going to be the guy who hates Emmanuelle, even though I hate Emmanuelle, and the guy who was absolutely repulsed by Blue Lagoon.
Yeah.
I'm going to build my entire identity off of that. So that's where I end on this. Is sex should be in movies. It should be presented probably at a way more female input than we've ever had.
Yeah.
It needs to be desensitized and presented more naturally and destigmatized. We need better representation of female sexuality. We need better representation of the spectrum of human sexuality. But you can't understand why sex is the way it is in mainstream film without understanding sex in sexploitation movies.
Yeah.
You just can't. Same reason, same way you can't understand violence unless you understand that eventually whatever was on the fringes, whatever was independent, whatever was outside the studio system, if it was successful enough, the studios co-opted. And that's what happened with sex and violence in the 70s.
Well, violence, violence, I think it was a combination of things. I think what you're talking about is part of it. But also when you're starting to talk about where gratuitous blood-soaked violence really started to come into play. And I mean, that's a conversation for a different day. But, you also got to figure it's around the time of Vietnam. And
Correct.
The way that the news was portraying violence was drastically different at that time, too. So it's like, well, if they're allowed to see it on the news, why can't we show it in movies? And so, yeah.
Well, an even more cynical version of that, Brian, is if you're seeing more blood and guts and more realistic gunshots on television on a weekly, day and nightly basis, like you said, then how are we going to shock and awe people into theater?
Exactly.
What are we going to exploit? So I guess what it all boils down to, my final thought as we bring this to a close, is that mainstream Hollywood is exploitation.
Yeah.
It's exploiting us as the audience. Do you want to see Michael Keaton as Batman again because we know he means something to you from 1989? Yes. Then we're going to exploit that to get you to buy a ticket to see it. Do you want to see the Flashpoint Paradox story told? Yes. Then we're going to exploit that. Do you want to see Jurassic Park, the original cast, come back because you have an emotional attachment to them? Then we're going to exploit that. Do you want to see the latest and greatest special effects? Do you want to see the latest dumb fuck spectacle for the Fast and Furious movies? Yep. Well, what stupid thing are they going to do now? We're going to exploit that. It's all a geek show. All of it. It's all a carnival, and it always has been. It's all Vanity Fair. Always has been, always will be. Dear critics, get off your high horse, get out of the Criterion collection, and start watching movies, the other 99% of movies.
Except when it comes to Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is in the Criterion collection.
Yeah, there you go. But you can watch movies like we did here today that are of subject matter that neither one of us are experts in. Watch the films, not like 2/3 of them, and actually be morally against them. Have personal value systems that are diametrically opposed to what Blue Lagoon and Emmanuelle stand for. That's true of both of us, I would say.
Yeah.
And not lose your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of what being a critical thinker is in the world. You can be morally disgusted by something and not become a crusader.
Yeah.
And you can become an advocate for things being better without becoming some sort of obsessive over how bad things were or how things are. you got to build. You can't just constantly tear down, I guess.
It is.
That's it. I'm done,
And
Brian.
it is a fact of life that if you are a film critic, if you are a film podcaster, if you are a film lover, you are going to see movies that you hate in the pursuit of seeing as much as possible. You do not, like Jason says, you do not have to make that the central aspect of your personality. And in fact, because you know what? You're just going to be as obnoxious as you claim somebody is who loves the thing that you hate.
Yes,
and it's
100%.
It's
100%.
absolutely, it's when so many people, it's said more and more that people are losing their media literacy, and I think a big part of that is coming from the fact that, part of that is the way that Hollywood exploits what we want to see in movies. I think that is a big part of it, but I also think it's a big part of the fact that people are not adventurous enough to see movies that they either have no interest in seeing or it just fits outside of their wheelbox of what they normally would go see. And it's like I don't know that I ever will have watched the Blue Lagoon. And you know what? I think my life would have been fine if I never had. I'm glad, but the thing is, I'm glad I did because of the fact that then I get to have this conversation with you about a subject that's interesting.
And we're better informed because we have seen it.
Exactly.
And we can even better where we go into things like that Brooke Shields documentary, which is a heavy discourse that needs to be had, better informed. We can now better contextualize it because we've experienced a piece of history.
Exactly.
And if you don't understand your history, what are you doing? It's just, if you're only going to read and watch and experience the things that you already know you like and already align with your sensibilities, how do you grow as a person?
Yeah. No, exactly. That you're not if you're just watching the same type of movies that you enjoy watching, you're not a film lover. You just like a certain subsect of movies. And to a certain extent, that's fine.
And that's fine.
But if you want to be a film lover, you have to dig deeper. And that's one of the things that I have tried to do and I know Jason does over Binge Movies. It's one of the things I try to do on my podcast. And it's one of the things I try to do when I go on to other podcasts like Jason. And I just love having these discussions. I love digging deeper into cinema. And, my taste may not always align with Jason's, sometimes to his horror. But but you know what? I always feel challenged by him to dig a little deeper. And for that I say, Jason, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on so we could talk. Probably it's got to be a record for you, the longest episode ever.
It's up there. It's up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just gave you shit for having a 3+ hour episode on summer camp movies, and look what we're doing.
I know. Yeah.
But like I said, that conversation went well, and I loved every minute of that conversation.
Same.
But before we close and sign off, Jason, where can people find you?
As long as Twitter exists, I will be there at Binge Movies. We're on Instagram at Binge Movies Lives. You can find us on all your favorite podcast apps. We also have a Patreon where I do a bunch of weird stuff. Like I'm doing a who knows how long it's going to take me, but a very long series of the audio essays themselves are short, but it's a multi-part audio essay series on works of Albert Pune, who passed away at the end of last year, who's sort of the master of the direct-to-video movie. Didn't start off that way. He started off as being first-run theater director, but by the end of the 80s was pretty much stuck in direct-to-video. He was one of the go-to workman directors for Canon Films, and worked with Charles Band as well at Empire. And I don't know if he did Full Moon, but probably. Doing stuff like that. I do instant reactions to new releases. That's on the main feed, but you get extended cuts of those instant reactions on Patreon. We do live events. There's a whole tier system. We have 4 tiers, 3 left, 1 sold out. If you look at that, see what the benefits are, see if you want to support a very weird show for people who love movies. And if you're a person who likes weird things and loves movies, you'll probably like Binge Movies. So go ahead and check it out. I'd be greatly appreciative. Thank you, Brian, for having me on. I'm losing my voice. I've ranted and raved. I feel bad for you for having to edit this, but I appreciate you as always, man. You put a lot of thought into what you say, and that is a damn rare commodity these days in film spaces.
It is, I mean, and the thing is, it's like, it doesn't even have to do with my age. I mean, I think as I've gotten older, it's like, I want to be able to talk as concisely about movies but also as thoughtfully about movies as possible. And I mean, that's why I seek out people like Jason and other friends of ours like Robert Yanis and Darren Lundberg and other people, because of the fact that and Carlo, I get to have those conversations with those people. And I appreciate, because I think we started off talking because of the fact that I had expressed an interest in being on Binge Movies, and then you reached out to me about it, and then I had you on as well. Yeah. Here, your first appearance here, and then we've kind of just gone back and forth with that, and it's been really great to get to know you, Jason, and I
likewise, friend.
It's always a pleasure. I mean, especially as a fellow Ohio person. So
yeah. Ohio native, baby. Yeah.
Yeah. But Jason, yes, thank you once again for joining me, and it is always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, friend. Always a pleasure.
I'd like to thank Jason for joining me on the podcast today. It is always such a pleasure to talk to him. I get something new out of talking to him every time I do, whether it's just via Twitter or whether it's via podcast. And I'm really grateful to have friends like Jason, who've been able to find a place for me on their podcast, as well as join me on my podcast to talk about subjects that interest me. And this was a great discussion. I think it's a necessary discussion, and I hope you got something out of it. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. July is going to be a fun month. We're going to be talking about a trilogy of films from one of the great filmmakers of our time, as well as one of the great composers of our time, in a massive roundtable that is going to be a lot of fun. Thank you very much to all my patrons at patreon.com/SonicCinema. Thank you very much to everybody who listens to the podcast, however you listen to the podcast. And finally, thank you very much to everybody who reads my work at www.sonic-cinema.com.